You might think the story of the caveman starts with stone tools, or fire, or even the iconic image of a man in a fur pelt dragging a club, but the truth is more subtle and more ancient than you might expect. We have to go back, way back, about 7 million years, to a time when the ancestors of modern humans and chimpanzees were still one and the same. Before we settle in and drift back in time together, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you falling asleep under city lights or out in the countryside? I love reading through every single one. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin the story of cavemen from the very, very beginning. Somewhere in what's now Chad, a creature walked the earth, who scientists later named Sahelanthropus chidensis. This being may have walked upright, or perhaps shuffled awkwardly on 2 legs and 4. But what matters is that this was possibly the earliest branch that would someday lead to us. Back then, the earth itself was different, wilder, warmer, with forests stretching into what is now desert, and no cities, no farms, no history, just nature, raw, undisturbed, and filled with potential. From Sahelanthropus, through millions of quiet, nameless years, came creatures like Australopithecus afarensis, known from the famous fossil called Lucy. She lived about 3.2 million years ago, and she stood just over a meter tall. Her world was a patchwork of forest and savanna, and her brain was small, about 1/3 the size of yours, but she walked upright. That simple ability to rise and look above the grass, to walk efficiently on 2 feet, changed everything. It freed the hands for carrying, making, sharing. It shifted the muscles of the pelvis, the spine, the neck. It began a chain of changes that would echo across deep time. And Lucy? She likely never knew she was special. She lived and died like countless others, but her kind, small, upright apes were on a path no other animal had taken. As time went on, some of these upright apes evolved into something stranger, tool makers. Not just random sticks or leaves like a chimp might use, but chipped stone, shaped by intention. The earliest known stone tools come from Gona, in Ethiopia, dated to about 2.6 million years ago. Imagine it, some long-forgotten ancestor picks up a piece of volcanic rock and strikes it against another. A sharp flake falls away, like the petal of a gray, glassy flower. That flake cuts. It pierces. It transforms a carcass into a meal. This was the birth of what scientists call the Oldowan toolkit, and the beings who wielded them are usually called Homo habilis, the handyman. But this name simplifies things. In truth, it was likely not just one species making these tools, but many. Early Homo, late Australopithecus. A confused and overlapping tapestry of beings, not a clear ladder. Over hundreds of thousands of years, those crude flakes became more refined. Some were shaped into pointed tips, others into choppers, scrapers, and cleavers. At sites like Kubi Fora and Olduvai Gorge in East Africa, archaeologists have uncovered whole landscapes of early human life. Stone tools, animal bones with cut marks, hearths. Not homes, not yet, but places where fire once burned. And fire was no small thing. It was the moment wildness began to bend to human will. The earliest controlled use of fire may go back nearly 1.5 million years. Possibly even more. The evidence is subtle. Scorched bones, reddened earth, clusters of ash. But even a small fire changes the rules. It wards off predators, softens food, lengthens the day. It creates space for speech, stories, and sleep. By the time of Homo erectus, around 1.9 million years ago, we see beings that were recognizably human in shape. Tall, strong, long-legged, they were wanderers. From Africa, they spread into Asia, reaching what's now Georgia, Indonesia, and China. These were not lumbering brutes, but survivors who traveled hundreds of miles, adapting to new climates and prey. In places like Zhoukoudian near Beijing, Homo erectus left behind skulls, tools, and ash, the signature of campfires that may have burned for generations. Imagine them sitting there, eyes flickering in the firelight, wrapped in hides, chewing tough roots, listening to the calls of unknown animals in the dark. What's fascinating is how long these early humans lived without changing much. Homo erectus survived for over 1.5 million years, far longer than modern humans have existed. They were stable, resilient, and surprisingly uniform across space and time. But change, eventually, came in brain size, in tool complexity, and in culture. In parts of Africa, a new species emerged, Homo heidelbergensis, with bigger brains and new ideas. They made Lavalo tools, shaped carefully from prepared stone cores. They may have hunted in coordinated groups. Some even built wooden spears, like those found at Schöningen in Germany over 300,000 years ago, preserved in the dark, wet soil of a lakeshore. These spears were aerodynamic, balanced, carefully crafted. These were no longer just scavengers. These were hunters. Soon after, the story branches again. One path led to the Neanderthals, who flourished in Ice Age Europe and parts of Western Asia. The other path led eventually to us, Homo sapiens. But that is a story for another part of our journey. Let's pick up where we left off, perched at the edge of something extraordinary. We've met Homo erectus, we've seen the firelight flickering in the dark, and we've touched the tools that marked a new phase of intelligence. But now, as we step deeper into the Ice Ages, something more complex, more emotionally familiar, begins to take shape. The old world of crude tools and instinct begins to blur into something closer to what we might call a human mind, still wrapped in fur and silence, but thinking deeper thoughts, imagining more. In Europe, the cold pressed down hard. Massive ice sheets rolled over the land, carving valleys and locking up water. This world was brutal, windswept, frozen and ruled by mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, and in the midst of this icy kingdom lived the Neanderthals. Stockier than modern humans, broad-chested with powerful limbs, they were built for endurance. But don't let the old stereotypes fool you. They weren't dumb or primitive. They made fire, shaped fine stone tools, wore clothes, and likely had spoken language. They hunted enormous game in coordinated groups, using thrusting spears and ambush tactics. Their bones tell of trauma, breaks, bruises, and healed injuries, suggesting care. Someone tended to the wounded, and perhaps most moving of all, they buried their dead. In places like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found Neanderthal skeletons laid to rest in shallow pits. One was an elderly man with severe disabilities, likely blind in one eye, with a withered arm and damaged leg, and yet he lived to old age. Someone had cared for him, helped him eat, move, survive. Near his body, traces of ancient pollen hint at flowers, perhaps placed with intention. Was this love? Ritual? Memory? We cannot know for sure, but in those silent graves lies something that reaches beyond biology, a whisper of soul. Meanwhile, far to the south, something different stirred in Africa. Around 300,000 years ago, in regions like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, the earliest known fossils of Homo sapiens appeared. These people looked more like us, flatter faces, rounded skulls, smaller brows. Their tools were refined, their culture beginning to shift. They still lived as foragers, moving with the seasons, hunting with spears, gathering roots, berries, nuts. But there was a growing complexity in how they saw the world. Red ochre, a kind of iron-rich pigment, shows up in archaeological sites, used perhaps for body paint, ritual, or marking tools, decoration, symbolism, identity. Over tens of thousands of years, modern humans spread slowly outward through East Africa, into Arabia, across the Sinai. Some waves vanished, others pressed on. Genetic evidence shows that one group of early Homo sapiens left Africa around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. And it is this wave that seeded the rest of the world, through the Middle East into Asia, and eventually Europe and beyond. Along the way, they encountered and interbred with Neanderthals. In fact, almost everyone alive today outside of Africa carries 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a trace of that ancient meeting, still echoing in our cells. But what gave modern humans the edge? Why did we survive while Neanderthals faded into extinction around 40,000 years ago? Some suggest climate change. Others say competition. But many believe it was culture, the ability to adapt rapidly, share ideas, innovate. Evidence from sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa shows early humans carving abstract designs into ochre blocks, creating shell beads, and using bone tools. These are not just survival strategies, they're signs of symbolic thought. They point to a brain that could not only make tools, but imagine futures, remember the dead, tell stories. As these humans entered Europe, the overlap with Neanderthals was brief, just a few thousand years. But it was enough. In the French cave of Grotte d'Urang, layers reveal tools and ornaments that may have been made by Neanderthals, influenced by modern humans. Cultural transmission, ideas flowing between species. It's a haunting image. Two kinds of humans meeting in the cold, perhaps trading, perhaps fighting, perhaps falling in love. The Neanderthals disappeared, but not entirely. Their legacy lives on in our blood, and perhaps in the oldest parts of our dreams. Now, let's pause for a moment. Picture this world, not as a string of events, but as a living, breathing place. The scent of wood smoke drifting through a valley. A child sleeping beside a fire. The crunch of frost underfoot. Generations moving across landscapes, singing, carving, laughing, grieving. These were not alien creatures. They were people. People who looked up at the stars and didn't have names for them, but still felt awe. People who shaped the earth, not with machines, but with persistence, memory, and the pressure of countless footsteps. The Upper Paleolithic period, beginning around 50,000 years ago, marked the dawn of what we call behavioral modernity. This is when art exploded. Literally, across caves in Europe, Asia, and even Indonesia, humans began painting animals on walls. Mammoths, lions, horses, ants. At Chauvet Cave in France, stunning images date back 36,000 years. Horses with flowing manes, owls with turned heads, lions crouched in the dark. These are not crude scribbles. They show motion, perspective, shading. The artist used torches to light the stone, mixed pigments with spit and fat, and worked in silence. Imagine them standing in the flickering dark, painting by firelight, their breath fogging in the cold. But why? Why paint? Why create beauty in the midst of such hardship? That's the mystery. Some believe these images were spiritual, hunting magic, prayers to unseen forces. Others think they were storytelling, records of memory. Whatever the reason, this was not instinct. It was something deeper. The need to express, to communicate across time. To say we were here, and tonight, as you listen and drift, you are touching that same thread, thousands of years later, still woven through human minds. As the Upper Paleolithic world deepened in complexity, so did the rhythm of human life. The people of this time were still nomads, gatherers and hunters, not yet farmers or builders of cities. But their lives were far from simple. They followed game across immense landscapes, tracked the stars, read the movement of clouds, the shape of a hoofprint in wet mud, and beneath the surface of survival, their minds were stretching into new realms. Language became more fluid, more nuanced. Myths began to take shape, passed quietly from generation to generation beside flickering flames. There were no books, no alphabets, but there were stories. There were always stories. Picture a group of humans, huddled under an overhang of limestone. The fire crackles low, throwing long shadows against the rock. One of the elders, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and lines etched deep into her face, begins to speak. Her voice is quiet but clear. She speaks of animals that once walked through that valley, of a hunt long ago, of the strange red light that danced in the northern sky. Around her, children listen with wide eyes. These moments were not just entertainment. They were education, identity, protection. To forget a story could be to forget how to survive, and survival was still very much the core of everything. These early humans lived during the height of the last ice age, when the northern hemisphere was locked in cold. In the shadows of glaciers, they followed herds of reindeer, mammoth, and bison. They knew how to trap fish under ice, how to read the flight of birds, how to find edible roots buried beneath snow. Their tools became increasingly sophisticated. Bone needles allowed for stitched clothing. Harpoons and barb points enabled fishing. And in regions like Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, people even crafted small ceramic figurines, some of the earliest known pottery on Earth. Among these was the famous Venus of Dolní Věstonice, a voluptuous figure with exaggerated features, possibly linked to fertility, memory, or ritual. Let that settle in your mind. Over 25,000 years ago, someone shaped a figure from clay, dried it by fire, and placed it with care. It was not functional. It didn't help cut meat or scrape hides. It was art, or perhaps religion, or identity. But it was made with intention, with vision. We will never know who that person was, or why they did it. But they left behind more than bones or ashes. They left behind meaning. This period also saw the development of more permanent shelters. In areas too cold or barren for constant migration, humans learned to construct dwellings from mammoth bones, wood, and hides. In places like Mezhorich in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered circular structures made of massive mammoth skulls and tusks, arranged with precision. These were not just piles of debris, they were homes. Inside, there were hearths, worked stone, bits of pigment, maybe a carved pendant left on a ledge, maybe the quiet sound of wind pressing against the hide walls. These shelters tell us something important, that people were beginning to imagine not just where they were, but how they wanted to live. Then, as the Ice Age began to loosen its grip, something profound happened. The megafauna, those massive creatures of the Pleistocene, began to vanish. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, saber-toothed cats. One by one, they disappeared. Some hunted to extinction, others pushed out by climate shifts too rapid to outrun. This loss didn't happen in a single generation. It was gradual, sometimes invisible. But it forced humans to adapt again. The old hunting grounds were empty. The cold forests receded. In response, people began to shift their focus to smaller game, to fish, to seeds and roots they might once have overlooked. And slowly, over millennia, this changing diet laid the groundwork for something revolutionary: domestication. The first animals to walk beside humans in partnership were likely wolves. Not as pets, not yet, but as companions, scavengers at the edge of camps, who grew less fearful, more helpful. Some may have warned of danger, others may have cleaned bones or offered warmth. Over time, the relationship deepened, and around 15,000 years ago, these wolves were no longer wild. They had become dogs, the first domesticated species. Imagine what that first bond looked like. A hunter sitting by a fire, tossing a scrap of meat to a limping wolf, a child reaching out to touch soft fur. These moments, repeated across thousands of years, created something new, not just in the animal, but in us. A companionship that crossed species, a shared path forward. As the climate warmed further, grasslands and forests expanded. Rivers grew stronger. Animals migrated anew. In this shifting world, humans began to settle more frequently in fertile places. River valleys, lake shores, caves near springs. They stayed longer. They buried their dead more formally. At sites like Sunjir in Russia, elaborate burials have been found. Children buried with thousands of ivory beads, painstakingly carved, spears, ornaments, tools. These were not utilitarian graves. They were statements. Perhaps of love, perhaps of loss, perhaps of power, and with them, we see the human heart more clearly. It had always been there, but now it had more to say, and it said even more through song. though no prehistoric melodies have survived. Archaeologists have found bone flutes, some over 40,000 years old, crafted with careful holes and smoothed edges, made from bird bones. These instruments could play notes, possibly even melodies. We will never know what the music sounded like, but we can be sure it was played in the dark, near fire, under stars. It may have echoed through caves, across rivers, over the hills. Music, like language, like story, became part of what made us human, and that humanity, by now, had reached nearly every corner of the world. From the cliffs of Iberia to the grasslands of India, from the coasts of Australia to the mountains of the Caucasus, humans walked and watched and wondered. In the Americas, people had crossed from Siberia into Alaska and moved south in waves. These were explorers, families, bands of wanderers. They learned new animals, new plants, new dangers, and still they made art, still they sang, still they dreamed. Let's keep walking, slowly now, into a world on the edge of transformation. By this point in our journey, tens of thousands of years have passed, almost imperceptibly. But the changes have been profound. Humans have learned to think in symbols, to bury their dead, to craft music from bone, to tell stories in pigment and flame. We've followed the trail from early hominins to Homo sapiens, watched as wolves curled near our fires, and seen the last mammoths vanish over the horizon. Now, something quieter begins to stir. Not the thunder of stampeding beasts or the hammer of stone tools, but a whisper of settlement, of staying in place. The age of pure wandering is fading. In the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Nile Valley through the Levant and into Mesopotamia, the environment was changing. Rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates, and Jordan swelled and shifted, and humans began to take note of more than just where the animals grazed. They noticed patterns, the way certain wild grasses grew in abundance after seasonal floods, the way seeds dropped and forgotten sprouted near their camps the following year. Slowly, subtly, this recognition sparked something radical: cultivation. Not farming, not yet, but a kind of gentle guiding of the land, an experiment in influence. This process wasn't immediate. It didn't begin with a plow or a field, but with foragers collecting wild barley, wheat, and lentils, bringing them back to camp, winnowing them with woven baskets, pounding them with stone mortars. Over time, they began to save the best seeds. They cleared small patches of land. They watched what grew, and in doing so, they crossed a threshold without realizing it. The first steps toward agriculture had begun, perhaps 12,000 years ago, in places like Abu Huraira in Syria and Jericho in the West Bank. These weren't cities, but they were more than camps. People were starting to settle. But even as the seeds of farming were being planted, most of the world still lived as their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years. In the cold forests of Europe, in the rain-drenched caves of the Pacific Northwest, in the scrublands of Africa and the highlands of Papua, people hunted and gathered in harmony with the land. Their knowledge was deep, intimate. They knew which roots calmed a fever, which mushrooms were safe, how to trap a bird with nothing but woven twine and patience. This knowledge was not written down. It was sung, danced, whispered, passed from grandmother to grandchild, with a seriousness we can barely fathom now. At Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, something astonishing rises from this ancient world. Massive stone circles, carved and erected by people who had no cities, no metal, no wheel, built more than 11,000 years ago. These megalithic structures predate Stonehenge by millennia. The pillars, up to 20 feet tall, are carved with reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, vultures. There are no homes nearby, no signs of daily life. This was a place of gathering, perhaps of ritual, or feasting, or something stranger still. It shows us that complex belief systems, organized construction, were not the product of farming societies, but may have helped create them. Perhaps people settled to be near sacred places, not the other way around. Elsewhere, In places like Catalhoyuk in central Anatolia, we see the first real signs of community living. Dating to around 9,000 years ago, this dense settlement had hundreds of mud brick homes packed tightly together, with rooftop access and no streets. The walls were painted with scenes of bulls, leopards, and even abstract designs that may have had spiritual meaning. Inside the houses, the dead were often buried beneath the floors, ancestors sleeping underfoot. This tells us something deeply human. People wanted to be near their past, to live surrounded by memory. They were no longer just surviving, they were belonging. But let's step back for a moment and remember the world beyond these early villages. Not everyone chose this new life. Many groups continued to follow the rhythms of the wild, to move with the seasons, to live lightly on the land. In some cases, they viewed the settlers not as advanced, but as strange. Why would anyone tie themselves to a single place? Why live with the risk of drought, flood, or crop failure? For many, mobility was still freedom, and they passed their values through generations untouched by the coming tide of agriculture. Meanwhile, in the Americas, a different story unfolded. Here, the first people arrived by land bridge or coastal migration, settling from Alaska to the tip of South America. In the Andes, they began to domesticate potatoes, quinoa, and llamas. In Mesoamerica, maize corn slowly evolved from a wild grass called teosinte, a transformation that would eventually feed civilizations. But this took time, thousands of years of observation, selection, and adaptation. These early farmers weren't inventing agriculture as a single act. They were dancing with the land in a long, slow negotiation. And while food slowly began to change human society, so did memory. Oral histories lengthened. Myths stretched further back, with more people living together and more generations building in one place. The past became heavier. We see this in burial practices, increasingly elaborate, with grave goods, ceremonial items, and in some cases entire burial mounds. These weren't just bodies laid to rest. They were messages. This person mattered. This person was part of a story. Even in small bands, people began to orient their identity around more than just kin. Roles formed. Shamans, elders, artisans. Someone might know the plants better than anyone. Another might be the only one who could call back a spirit through song. Someone else might remember the stars. These weren't rulers, not yet, but they were the first seeds of social complexity. Not everyone did the same thing anymore, and that change would ripple outward in ways that would transform the world. And yet, through all of this, the essence of the caveman, the original human, still lived on, in the quiet rituals before a hunt, in the way fire was tended each night, in the lullabies sung to a restless child, in the shapes drawn in dust by idle fingers. These small gestures, repeated over tens of thousands of years, became the foundation of culture. And culture, in its deepest sense, is not something you inherit. It's something you tend, like a flame in the dark. As we gently step further into this long human journey, we begin to see more of ourselves reflected in the shadows of those early lives. The caveman, by this point in history, is no longer just a rugged figure in a fur pelt hunched inside a cave. That was always an oversimplification, a hollow cartoon of something far richer. These early people, your ancestors, my ancestors, were innovators, philosophers in their own way, musicians, builders of meaning. Their world was tactile and immediate, yet also deeply symbolic. And the further we travel through time, the more clearly we hear their voices, not in words, but in stone, in fire, in memory. One of the most powerful expressions of early human imagination came through burial and ritual in the late Mesolithic period, that strange transitory time between the Paleolithic and the rise of agriculture. People didn't just bury the dead. They honored them in ways that defied easy explanation. At sites like Lepenski Vir, located along the Danube River in modern-day Serbia, people created complex settlements with trapezoidal buildings and shrines, some oriented toward the sunrise, They carved intricate stone sculptures, often of human faces mixed with fish, mysterious beings, perhaps gods or ancestors. These weren't just shelters. They were ceremonial spaces, linked to the rhythms of the river and the memory of the dead. The cave had become a house, and the house had become a temple. And with this deepening of space came a deepening of time. People began to mark seasons, not just by instinct, but intentionally. They tracked the solstice, aligned structures to the sunrise, remembered when the salmon returned. In Scotland, at a site called Warren Field, archaeologists uncovered a pit alignment that may have functioned as a lunar calendar over 10,000 years ago, the oldest known time-measuring structure. These weren't astronomers with telescopes. These were foragers and hunters, watching the sky, carving time into the land. It shows how essential time had become to human life. Not just daylight or night, but memory, rhythm, story. And the stories, by now, were everywhere. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples carried what are now called Dreamtime stories, vast interwoven myths that describe the creation of the land, animals, people. These narratives, passed down through song and ceremony for tens of thousands of years, encode not just spiritual meaning, but geographical knowledge. A rock formation is not just a rock. It's a resting serpent, a warning, a direction. This oral mapping system, so sophisticated, predates Western writing by millennia. And though we can't say what cavemen in Europe or Asia believed, we can be sure they too saw the land as alive, full of spirit and memory. You don't survive for 300,000 years without knowing every tree, every shadow, every season. In Japan, the Jomon people, beginning as early as 14,000 years ago, created some of the earliest known pottery in the world. Their culture, long before rice farming took hold, was rich with creativity. They decorated their ceramic vessels with cord-marked patterns and swirling designs, not out of necessity, but expression. They also made clay figurines known as dogu, small stylized figures with oversized eyes and abstract forms. Some were broken deliberately, possibly as part of rituals. These artifacts tell us that even in a pre-agricultural society, there was time for art, time for symbolism, time for reverence, and still, the cave remained a place of memory. In regions across Spain and France, more cave art has been found, some older than 35,000 years, and others far more recent, created just 10,000 years ago. These painted places weren't abandoned in favor of farming or cities. They remained sacred, used again and again. Footprints of children preserved in clay, charcoal handprints layered over each other like ghosts. These weren't random drawings. They were rituals repeated across generations. Entering a cave may have felt like entering a spirit world, a place of dreams, of ancestors, of transformation. Even today, deep in a dark cave, something shifts. The mind turns inward. The breath slows. The silence begins to speak. Meanwhile, humans continued to spread. In the Arctic, Inuit ancestors developed tools for life in extreme cold. Harpoons, sleds, tailored clothing stitched from sinew. In the Amazon, people learned how to process toxic plants like cassava into food. In Africa, pastoralists began herding goats and cattle across the savanna. Every environment, no matter how harsh, was mapped and understood through generations of trial, failure, and wisdom. It's easy to forget that the caveman wasn't confined to Europe. Our species touched every biome: desert, tundra, rainforest, mountain. Each one reshaped what it meant to be human, and in every one of those places, the fire remained central. It was more than heat. It was a center, a social anchor. Around it, food was shared, stories were told, wounds were healed, silence was kept. The fire was constant, yet alive, breathing, shifting, dancing in the wind. Some communities never let the fire go out. It was tended day and night, passed from hearth to hearth. Fire was life. Fire was memory. Let yourself feel the rhythm of those old lives for a moment. the weight of a hide blanket across your shoulders, the sting of winter wind on your cheek, the soft crunch of footsteps through fresh snow, the smell of smoked meat, of pine needles, of damp earth. In those details, you are not separate from them. You are them. The distance between you and a Paleolithic hunter is not as great as it seems. Your hands could still shape a spear. Your heart could still recognize a song sung to the stars. And maybe that's the real story of the caveman, not of some ancient other, but of ourselves. The self we've buried under asphalt and plastic and glowing screens, the self that once sat by the fire, eyes wide, listening to the crackle of wood and the howl of wolves far off in the trees. That part of you isn't gone. It's just quiet, sleeping, but it remembers. Let's continue walking slowly through this long twilight of prehistory, where so much of the human experience was shaped not by kings or cities or written records, but by quiet repetition, shared memory, and the rhythm of the earth itself. The caveman, as we've come to understand, was not a single type of person or a single moment in time. It was a mosaic, a long continuum of adaptation, spirit, and story. Even now, we are only beginning to truly understand the subtle depth of those ancient lives. They were not a prologue to history. They were the foundation of it. As farming began to take deeper root across the world, you might imagine that life became easier, more predictable. But the truth is, it became more complicated. Sedentary life allowed for larger populations, but it also brought new dangers, disease, crop failure, social conflict. Where once a failed hunt might have meant moving to new territory, a failed harvest could mean starvation. People began to hedge their bets. They developed storage pits, granaries, ways to dry and preserve food. With these precautions came planning, and with planning came hierarchy. At sites like Tel Abu Horeira, the bones of early farmers show signs of physical strain, backs bent from grinding grain, joints worn down by hours of repetitive motion. This was the cost of the Neolithic Revolution. A body reshaped not by running across plains or climbing trees, but by labor. Hands that once flaked obsidian now pressed seeds into soil. Feet that once wandered miles now circled small fields, again and again. And yet they built something lasting. Permanence, continuity, place. With this shift came the rise of true villages and early social structures. Leadership roles began to emerge. Someone managed the harvest, another oversaw rituals. Perhaps one family became keepers of the seed stock, while another became known for healing or crafting tools. Slowly, what we now call society began to take form. And with society came identity, not just individual, but collective. People saw themselves not only as members of a family, but of a community, a shared name, a common ancestry. We can see this shared identity in the monuments that began to appear, great stone arrangements that required collaboration, planning, and purpose. In Brittany, France, near the village of Carnac, there stands a field of over 3,000 standing stones, menhirs, stretching for kilometers in orderly lines. Some are small, others towering. Their meaning is still uncertain. Were they tomb markers, solar calendars, ritual processions? The truth may be lost, but the effort behind them is undeniable. No single person could have placed these stones. It took a community and a vision. And further north, on the wind-swept plains of what is now Wiltshire in England, the earliest phases of Stonehenge were beginning to take shape. Long before the massive sarsen stones were raised, people dug circular ditches and set wooden posts. The place was already sacred, long before the stone ring we know today. It wasn't just about marking time. It was about connecting earth and sky, death and rebirth. These early architects of memory weren't engineers in the modern sense. They were something older, builders of meaning. Across the globe, similar patterns emerged. In Peru, people constructed platform mounds in places like Caral, using woven baskets to carry earth, a massive collective undertaking with no evidence of warfare or hierarchy. In the Near East, complex tell settlements rose layer upon layer. In Africa, early cattle cultures like the Kintampo began to blend herding with foraging, reshaping the land through both movement and cultivation. Everywhere, people were creating place, not just physical, but symbolic. Land became story. Story became structure. And the old ways, the Paleolithic patterns, didn't vanish. They persisted in song, in ritual, in the way people still watch the stars, or turn to caves in times of change. Even with homes and fields, people still carved animal forms from bone, still painted with ochre, still buried their dead with beads and shells and feathers. In some regions, foraging remained the dominant lifestyle for thousands of years after farming had begun elsewhere. This wasn't regression, it was adaptation. Some environments were better suited for mobility. Some peoples chose freedom over settlement. They were not relics of the past, but guardians of a different kind of wisdom. And there is one place where the memory of the caveman truly lingers, deep within you. It's in the way your senses still light up in nature, in the way your heartbeat quickens around firelight. It's in your instinct to gather, to share food, to tell stories. Every time you listen to the rain on a roof, or feel drawn to the stars, or dream of a landscape you've never seen, that's a voice speaking from a time before history. A voice that once heard wolves cry in the dark and understood their language. In today's world, we often talk about technology and innovation as if they're new, but the first tools were technologies. The first cave painting was innovation. The first buried body, carefully laid to rest with a stone blade and a bead. That was philosophy. The caveman wasn't a brute stumbling through darkness. He was a thinker, a singer, a keeper of fire and myth. The world we live in now, cities, clocks, stories, whispered before sleep, it all began there. And even now, late at night, when the noise of the day fades, there's still something ancient in you that listens differently, that softens, that leans toward warmth and voice. Maybe you're feeling it now, as you lie there in the quiet. That part of you that remembers how to sit still in the dark, how to listen, how to feel safe just by knowing you're not alone. We return now to that stillness, the kind you can only feel when the night is deep and the mind is open to quiet things. You've come so far already, walked alongside ancient footsteps, watched flickers of firelight dance on stone walls that haven't seen daylight in tens of thousands of years. And yet the story continues, not because we need more information, but because this is how humans have always learned, slowly, together. In the dark, when the world is calm, and the stories are free to wander. At this point in our journey, the Stone Age was winding toward its final phase, not in a dramatic ending, but in a slow unfurling, like the final coals of a fire long tended. Farming was becoming more common, though unevenly. In some regions, it took centuries to catch on. In others, people blended agriculture with the foraging wisdom of their ancestors. The world was not divided into civilized and primitive. It was a patchwork, a living, breathing network of human strategies and identities. Every valley had its rhythm, every group its way of life. In China's Yellow River Basin, millet farming began to reshape the land around 9,000 years ago. At the same time, rice cultivation emerged further south in the Yangtze Basin. These weren't small garden patches. They were intentional, organized, often supported by early irrigation and seasonal planning. With these shifts came pottery, painted, incised, sometimes fired in large communal kilns. Villages grew, with storage buildings, communal halls, burial areas. But even as communities expanded, they remained grounded in the same ancient pattern: family, fire, food, story. Far to the west, in what we now call the Levant, societies that once clustered around fertile valleys began to build megalithic tombs. In the region of modern-day Israel, sites like Ain Malaha show remains of round houses with stone foundations, early domestic spaces where families slept, ate, dreamed. What's striking is that even in these more permanent settlements, people still buried dogs alongside humans. One grave held a woman curled gently with her pup, both carefully placed, as if in shared slumber. These weren't livestock. They were companions, a relationship rooted not in utility, but in trust. In the forests of northern Europe, the Mesolithic peoples, who lived between the Paleolithic and Neolithic, left behind other kinds of traces. At the site of Starcar in England, excavations have revealed wooden platforms, antler headdresses, and layers of organic materials preserved in peat. Among the most striking finds were red deer skulls, carefully modified into masks. These were not tools or decorations. They were ceremonial, possibly worn in rituals, hunts, or dances. Some speculate they were used by shamans to enter trances, to speak with animals, to blur the line between species. Whatever their purpose, they tell us again, the spiritual life of early humans was rich, active, and essential. By now, people were also learning how to shape the land itself, terracing hillsides for planting, clearing forests, managing water with canals. These were not monumental acts, not yet, but they required memory, knowledge passed through generations, perhaps drawn in the dirt with a stick, or shared by gesture and repetition. These skills were rarely recorded, but they were encoded in daily life, in the way a tool was sharpened, in the timing of a harvest, in the way a mother taught her child to dig just so, where the soil felt right, where the sun stayed long. Let's take a moment to imagine that world again. Not just the facts, but the feelings. The sounds of morning in a village where smoke curls up into a pale blue sky. The rhythm of footsteps on packed earth. The thud of stone on grain. A child chasing a stray dog through rows of barley. The laughter of someone carving a fish from bone. These weren't nameless primitives. They were people, just like you, with frustrations, hopes, quiet joys. And they were making choices that would echo across time. But not all echoes are of peace. As populations grew and resources became more valuable, new pressures emerged. Conflict, competition, territory. At some sites we find signs of violence. Skeletons with projectile wounds, fortifications built of wood and stone, groups buried hurriedly. It's likely that interpersonal violence had always existed. But now, with permanent settlements and stored food, there was something to defend, something to lose. The seeds of organized conflict were being sown, though war, as we would later define it, was still a long way off. Even so, for many communities, life was still deeply communal. Food was shared. Tools were repaired cooperatively. Stories were told for all to hear. Elders were respected, not for power, but for memory. They carried knowledge no one else could. In a world without books or recordings, memory was survival. The elder who remembered which plant cured fever, or where the river once flooded, or when the deer returned, that person was a library, a living archive. And throughout this time, the landscape itself continued to shape thought. Rivers weren't just sources of water, they were pathways, boundaries, beings. Mountains weren't just tall, they were sacred. Trees, particularly massive, ancient ones, were treated with reverence. In many places, stones were marked, painted, or stood upright, perhaps to mark time, direction, or spiritual centers. Nature was not a backdrop, it was alive, a companion, a force to respect, honor, and fear. That relationship with nature, so central to the caveman's world, was not based on domination. It was a conversation, one of careful listening, of humility. And maybe that's what we've forgotten most. Not the tools, or the fire, or the songs, but the listening. The ability to pause and hear the wind shift, to notice when the birds go quiet, to understand that the earth is always speaking, if we are willing to hear it. As the Stone Age rolled slowly toward its end, and metal began to glint faintly on the horizon, humans had already written a vast and beautiful story, without a single word written down. You are part of that story, just by listening. Now the air feels different. doesn't it? We're moving through the final moments of a world defined by stone, by wildness, by memories spoken aloud, a world where tools were chipped from rock, where the stars were named not in books but in breath, and where the shape of a mountain could be a god or a grandmother. You followed these footsteps well, slowly, patiently, and as we ease further into this transition, the quiet gives way to something stirring. Not noise, not yet, but potential, the faint shimmer of something new, something sharp, something made of metal. But before metal, before the thrum of forges and the clang of hammers, there was still the old world, alive and evolving. Farming had taken hold in many places, but it had not erased the older ways. People continued to forage, to hunt, to live lightly on the land in vast stretches of the planet, from the highlands of New Guinea to the forests of Central Africa to the Arctic edge of Siberia. Cultures persisted that knew no plow, no herd, no harvest season, only movement, story, and rhythm. The Stone Age, in that sense, never truly ended. It merely faded in some places while continuing with quiet dignity in others. In regions where farming did deepen its roots, society began to stratify. You can see it in the burials, where once everyone was buried with simple goods, a pendant, a flint blade, a bead. Now we start to see graves with gold, with ivory, with entire animals placed beside the dead. Status had entered the picture. Some people, perhaps leaders or priests or warriors, were laid to rest with grandeur, others with little or nothing. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was structure, and structure brings power. Yet, there's beauty even in this change. Because with permanence and population came specialization. Not everyone had to hunt. Some could weave. Others could carve, paint, heal. In the region now called Ukraine, at a site known as Tripilia, people built enormous villages, some stretching for hundreds of structures, and decorated their pottery with hypnotic, swirling motifs. These designs weren't just for function. They were art, expression, maybe even messages. Someone, perhaps many someones, had the time to sit, to imagine, to create something that had no other purpose than to be seen and remembered. And memory, by now, was becoming even more tangible, not just spoken or painted on stone, but carved into tablets, etched into bone. At sites like Vincha in the Balkans, archaeologists have found symbols on clay artifacts that some believe could represent an early form of writing. Not a full language, but something more than decoration. Marks with intention, with pattern, with meaning that might have been shared among people who never learned to read in our sense, but who knew exactly what those shapes conveyed. While in Mesopotamia, along the Tigris and Euphrates, settlements like Eridu and Uruk began to rise. These places would later be called cities, but even in their earliest phases, they were more than clusters of homes. They were spiritual centers, trade hubs, gathering places. People built temples, baked clay bricks, crafted tools and ornaments, and began experimenting with metal. First copper, soft and reddish, hammered into blades or hooks. This wasn't yet the Bronze Age, but it was the doorway, the first glint of a new material world. Even as these changes rippled outward, the old fire still burned in distant places. In the rainforests of the Congo, forager societies thrived. In the mountains of the Caucasus, herders moved with the seasons, just as their ancestors had for generations. In the Pacific, canoes skimmed the surface of blue water, carrying humans to islands untouched by foot. These were not behind. They were different, adapted. Every lifestyle you've heard so far, from cave dweller to farmer to sailor, was a valid answer to the same ancient question, how shall we live? And that question echoes still. There's something else happening during this time, something invisible in the archaeological record, but no less real. The emotional complexity of human life was deepening. With larger communities came new pressures, envy, rivalry, longing. People could now compare themselves to others, not just by strength or skill, but by possessions, by lineage, by stories whispered behind hands. Social bonds were still essential, but more delicate. Rituals became more elaborate, perhaps to reinforce harmony. Festivals, dances, shared meals, the glue that kept a community from unraveling. You can almost hear it now, the sound of drums echoing in a valley, the chant of voices rising with the stars. People painted not just caves now, but their own skin. Jewelry sparkled not from wealth, but from meaning. A shell passed down 3 generations, a tooth from a hunted beast, a braid woven before marriage. These things held no currency. They held value, the kind only a story can give. And what of the children? They've always been there, running barefoot through grass, learning the world one scraped knee at a time. In every era, the young were taught not with lectures, but with play, imitation, games. A young girl learning how to strike flint from stone by watching her uncle. A boy learning which leaves sting and which soothe by the touch of his grandmother's hand. Learning wasn't separate from life. It was life. Every mistake a lesson. Every wound a teacher. By now, language had taken on regional complexity. Dialects, accents, local idioms. A child from one valley might understand the people from the next, or they might not. Songs passed down in one group would be unknown in another. Human culture was fracturing, not in a bad way, but in a rich way. Diversity bloomed. What one people carved into their pots, another painted onto bark. What one sang under the stars, another danced into the dust. And yet beneath it all, the roots were the same. Fire, family, food, the body wrapped in hide, the stars overhead, the longing to remember. The Stone Age didn't end all at once. It didn't vanish like a light switched off. It melted slowly into what came next, its bones buried under cities, its echoes woven into myth. But the people who lived it, the ones we call cavemen, they didn't think of themselves as ancient. They thought of themselves as now, as alive. Just like you do. Let's take another breath together, slow and deep, because the world we're entering now is one of quiet thresholds. The Stone Age is fading, but not gone. Its spirit still clings to the edges of valleys, to the hands that shape the earth, to the bones buried beneath the floor of a simple house. We've followed the thread from the earliest upright hominins to the rise of agriculture, the dawn of pottery, the first villages, and now that thread is beginning to braid into something denser, more complicated. A world of metal, yes, but also memory, ambition, belief. A world where people were not just surviving, but becoming. In Anatolia, at the site of Çatalhöyük, which we visited briefly before, something remarkable continued to unfold. This wasn't a village anymore. It was a sprawling proto-city, with tightly packed homes built wall to wall, accessed from the rooftops. There were no streets. Movement happened above, not between. And inside these homes, art. Murals of bulls and vultures and geometric symbols. Carvings of leopards and breasts. The dead were still buried under the floors, often beneath the sleeping places of the living. This tells us something that's easy to miss. The past wasn't separate. It was inside the home. Ancestors weren't distant. They were close, quite literally underfoot, watching, remembered. And this intertwining of life and death, of present and memory, echoes through other cultures of the time. In Neolithic Britain, for example, we see the construction of long barrows, massive earth mounds used as collective tombs. They weren't just burial chambers. They were monuments, built with care, aligned with celestial events, and sometimes used for generations. The dead weren't hidden. They were honored. And with this honoring came a new sense of lineage. People were starting to think in terms of heritage, of belonging to something larger than the self. Across the sea, in what would become Ireland, sites like Newgrange rose, a passage tomb, constructed over 5,000 years ago. Its inner chamber is illuminated only once a year, at the winter solstice, when the rising sun strikes through a narrow passageway and lights the central chamber. This is not accident. It is architecture wrapped around time. A calendar made of stone. And imagine what that first light must have looked like. Piercing the dark, touching the bones of the dead with golden fire. It was science. It was ceremony. It was story made real. Elsewhere, in the fertile valleys of the Indus River, people were beginning to build the foundations of what would become one of the world's great civilizations. Cities like Mehrgarh and later Harappa began to emerge. But at this early stage, around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, these were still transitional communities, rooted in Stone Age tradition. They used flint tools, handcrafted ceramics, and built homes of mud brick. There's evidence of early dentistry here too. A drilled molar, possibly treated to relieve pain. A reminder that technology isn't always about metal or machines. Sometimes it's a tiny hole in a tooth, shaped by steady hands and old knowledge. And what of the Americas? There the pace was different, but no less profound. In the Andes, people were slowly moving from foraging to farming. They grew potatoes and quinoa, raised guinea pigs and llamas. On the coast, they fished and traded across vast distances. They built mounds and ceremonial platforms, not yet cities, but more than camps. In North America, cultures like the archaic peoples of the eastern woodlands were gathering in larger groups, building earthen mounds of their own, experimenting with plant cultivation. They weren't isolated. They were evolving in harmony with their landscapes, guided by memory and intuition. One of the most powerful elements of this time, and one that still echoes today, was the way people began to shape their identities through objects, tools, ornaments, clothing, weapons. These weren't just functional, they were expressive. A polished stone axe might be more than a tool. It could be a gift, a symbol of alliance, a rite of passage. A necklace made of seashells might link a person to the coast, even if they lived deep inland. Through these objects, humans began to declare who they were, where they came from, and what they valued. Trade, too, began to blossom in this period, not in the form of markets or merchants, but in slow, steady movement. Obsidian from volcanic regions ended up hundreds of miles away. Shells from the ocean appeared deep in deserts. Amber, jet, and flint traveled hand to hand through complex networks of exchange. These were not always trades of profit. Sometimes they were gifts, offerings, exchanges between distant clans. The Stone Age was not silent or static. It was mobile, connected, alive with movement. And in the middle of all this, in the still, private space between ceremony and survival, the human spirit continued to search for meaning. We know this not just from art, but from arrangement, from care. In graves where children were buried with beads, in hearths rebuilt in the same place, year after year, in the way tools were shaped with elegance, even when a rough edge would have sufficed. These are not the marks of desperation. They're the marks of beauty, intention, continuity. The end of the Stone Age is often told as a triumph, metal replacing stone, cities replacing huts, writing replacing speech. But this is a narrow view. The truth is far more nuanced. Many Stone Age cultures transitioned slowly, blending old and new. Others resisted, holding fast to what had always worked. Some disappeared not through conquest, but through change. Their ways absorbed into newer rhythms, their stories passed down in whispers. And through it all, the land remembered. Caves once filled with fire and song fell silent. Fields once hunted became farms. Paths once followed by barefoot wanderers were slowly covered by roads, then by cities, then by silence. But even today, if you listen, really listen, to the wind across a valley, to the rustle of trees, to your own breath in the quiet of night, you might hear them, the ones who came before, the ones who shaped the world not with machines, but with their hands, their fire, their stories. Here we are, drifting through the final stretch of this long, patient era, the Stone Age. But it doesn't end with a bang, it ends with a breath. With the soft fading of obsidian and flint into copper and bronze. With the echo of footsteps down a valley path that will one day become a road. The story of the caveman, as we often picture it, rugged, simple, brutish, was never quite right. What we've uncovered together is something deeper, softer, more enduring. These were not relics from a forgotten time. They were people. They are people. Their blood moves in your veins. Their habits echo in your thoughts. Their stories survive in the very shape of your world. But even as the Stone Age wanes, some of its most profound moments still remain. In the mountains of modern-day Armenia, for example, people began to live in ways that blend old and new, building stone houses, working copper, and continuing rituals that may stretch back millennia. They left behind wine vats, shrines, and even what may be the oldest known shoe, a soft leather slip-on, carefully buried in dry soil. This was not a tool of survival. It was clothing, comfort, attention to detail. That tells you everything you need to know about how human life had evolved. And just as copper began to flow through the hands of metalworkers, another shift was taking place. Perhaps more subtle, but just as revolutionary: timekeeping. Not just tracking the sun or the moon, but organizing life around it. Planting calendars, ritual cycles, sacred dates. In places like Nabta Playa, in Egypt's western desert, stone circles aligned with celestial events were erected thousands of years before Stonehenge. These early astronomers didn't write down their findings, but they built them in stone. A silent, enduring language of light and shadow. As tools became more precise, so did the divisions of labor. Now, for the first time, there were true artisans. People whose main skill was making a flint knapper, whose hands knew the exact angle to strike. A potter who shaped clay with rhythm passed down through generations. A weaver who knew how to twist fibers into thread, strong enough to carry a basket or cradle a child. This specialization wasn't just efficiency. It was identity. People began to define themselves not just by kin or clan, but by craft. And with craft came beauty. Consider the stone beads of Mergar, strung together in long necklaces, or the intricate bone carvings of the Ertebole culture in northern Europe, spirals, animals, repeating patterns that served no obvious function, but were clearly made with care. These were not the acts of survival. They were the acts of meaning, of connection, a way to leave something behind, even if only for a moment. But there were deeper, more intangible transformations underway as well. As people began to live in larger groups, they also began to imagine larger stories. Not just personal myths or local legends, but shared cosmologies, ways of understanding the entire world. Gods and spirits began to take on more shape, not necessarily as statues or temples, just yet, but in dances, in songs, in the bones of animals arranged in careful patterns, in symbols carved into stone, hidden beneath the earth, or drawn into the curves of a pottery bowl. These weren't random. They were part of a system, a worldview that tied the living to the dead, the earth to the stars, the people to each other. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath, the first faint sounds of the next age began to stir. People in the Balkans and the Near East began to smelt copper, melt it, shape it into tools sharper than any flint. Slowly, they learned to mix copper with tin, creating bronze, stronger, more durable, more symbolic. Stone tools were still in use, but metal began to take their place in the places of honor: the grave of a chief, the hands of a priest, the belt of a warrior. Not just objects, statements, markers of status, of change. Still, many communities held tightly to their stone ways. In the northern coasts of Scandinavia, in the high Andes, in the forests of Papua, stone tools continued to be shaped and used, not out of ignorance, but because they worked, because the knowledge was still alive. The end of the Stone Age didn't arrive like a tidal wave. It crept in, gently, unevenly. With every flint blade laid aside, a memory lingered. With every bronze knife forged, a ritual ended, and a new one began. And what of the caves? The silent witnesses to so much of this long story. Many of them fell out of use as people moved into open-air villages and houses of stone and wood, but others remained sacred. They became places of pilgrimage, of ceremony. A few were sealed off, as if to protect what was left inside, as if those who came after would one day need to return, to remember, to listen. And that's what we're doing here together, listening. Listening to a story too vast for a single voice, too rich for a single time. A story still being told in our customs, in our instincts, in the fire that still draws people close when the dark comes in. The Stone Age didn't end, it just changed shape. It moved into us. There's something humbling in that, something grounding, because for all the noise and light of the modern world, the oldest parts of you are still tuned to a different frequency, to the crackle of a hearth, the scent of pine, the hush of wind moving through tall grass. The part of you that loves stories in the quiet hours. That's the same part that once sat wrapped in hide, watching the flames dance on the ceiling of a cave, listening to someone older tell you where you came from. As we continue deeper into this quiet unfolding of humanity's story, the world begins to settle into patterns that feel strangely familiar. Fields being worked, villages humming with daily life, tools refined, relationships growing more layered. But under all of that, the heartbeat of the Stone Age still pulses. It's there in the rhythm of a flint being struck, in the grain of carved wood, in the careful shaping of a tool, or the deliberate laying of stones for a grave. The difference now is that people are starting to think in terms of legacy, not just survival, not just story, but structure. The kind of permanence that tries to hold time still. You see it most clearly in the first monumental constructions, not isolated shrines or single tombs, but entire ceremonial landscapes. At the Ness of Brodgar in the Orkney Islands, a sprawling Neolithic temple complex began to rise over 5,000 years ago, long before metal was common in the region. Walls of finely laid stone, massive buildings oriented with cosmic precision, painted interiors, carefully placed animal remains. This wasn't a place people stumbled upon. It was chosen, crafted, maintained across generations. Its scale suggests coordination, perhaps leadership, but still rooted in ritual, in shared belief rather than control. And at the same time, people were learning to reshape nature itself. They dug ditches, raised causeways, built mounds and banks, not for defense or farming, but for meaning. These were ceremonial corridors, gathering places for rites we can only guess at. Think of it, thousands of people working together to move stone, carve out earth, mark alignments with stars they couldn't measure but still understood. There's something profoundly moving about that. The idea that before we built cities for commerce, we built landscapes for spirit. But of course, spirit and life were never separate. For the people of the Neolithic, everything was part of a whole: food, death, love, harvest, stars. There was no division between sacred and mundane. A woman grinding grain was as much a part of the world's magic as a priest laying offerings in a tomb. In fact, the everyday was the sacred. A meal shared, a birth attended, a wound healed with herbs passed down from a grandmother's hands. These were not ordinary things. They were the foundation of everything. Let's slow here and rest for a moment inside one of those homes. Picture it, walls of packed earth or wattle and daub, perhaps stone where resources allowed, a central hearth burning low, smoke rising gently through an opening in the roof. Along the walls, baskets woven from reeds, tools hanging on wooden pegs, a child asleep under a fir, a parent carving, sewing, grinding. The sounds are soft, a lullaby humming low, the occasional crackle of firewood, maybe a dog shifting beside the warmth. Outside, the night settles on the fields, on the paths, on the distant hills. But in here, there is comfort, continuity, home. In places like Skara Brae, a well-preserved Neolithic village on the coast of Scotland, you can still walk through those homes today. They are made of stone, fitted together with care, their interiors remarkably intact. Stone beds, stone dressers, hearths in the center, the impressions of lived-in lives. You feel it when you walk through. Not just that people were here, but that they lived with intention. They arranged their world, their belongings, their spaces, not at random, but with a clear sense of balance and presence. And while the homes speak to stability, the graves continue to whisper of belief. In many Neolithic cultures, death wasn't the end. It was transformation. In some cases, bodies were left exposed in the open sky burials, allowing nature to reclaim them. In others, bones were carefully arranged, often collected into ossuaries, with skulls placed separately, sometimes painted, sometimes decorated. These weren't acts of morbid curiosity. They were acts of reverence, of anchoring the living to the past, of remembering in a way that went beyond words. Across the globe, echoes of this reverence appear in different forms. In Japan, the Jomon people continued their complex culture of foraging, fishing, and crafting, even as neighboring regions shifted to farming. Their pottery became more elaborate, dynamic, flame-like patterns rising off the vessels. Their figurines became more expressive. They lived in pit houses, seasonally or year-round, but their sense of art and identity remained vivid. For them, the land gave enough. Movement, not settlement, remained their truth. And in Africa, so often overlooked in prehistoric studies, despite being humanity's cradle, people continued to develop sophisticated stone tools well into the later Holocene. Microlithic technologies in places like southern Africa were incredibly refined. Tiny geometric blades set into wood or bone, used for hunting, fishing, even sewing. These tools weren't primitive, they were precise, crafted with expertise honed through countless generations. The people who made them were not waiting for metal. They had mastered what they needed, but metal was coming, slowly. In places like the Iranian Plateau and the Caucasus, copper tools began to appear, not in mass quantities, but as prestige items. The first smelting fires would have seemed almost magical, stone that weeps metal, that can be shaped and sharpened. This new material didn't replace stone overnight. It took generations, but the shift had begun. A new language of tools, trade, and social roles was forming. Still, in many corners of the world, stone remained. In the highlands of New Guinea, people continued to farm with stone tools well into modern times. In the Arctic, bone and stone remained dominant because they worked. The Stone Age was never truly left behind. It simply became part of the foundation, a quiet strength beneath everything that came after. And as we near the end of this phase in our story, we realize something profound. The caveman was never just about stone or survival. He was about connection to the land, to each other, to the things that mattered, the fire, the family, the memory. These early humans didn't vanish. They became us. Here in the slow hush of the night, with the long rhythm of time settling like dust around your thoughts, we now find ourselves tracing the final threads of the world shaped in stone. We've walked with the first tool makers, shared silence in the caves of painted hands, listened to stories whispered beside fires that burned through ice ages. And now, with each careful step forward, the world changes. Not all at once, but like a rising tide that slowly rewrites the coastline. The Stone Age doesn't end with a crash of metal or the glow of city lights. It ends with footsteps, generations of them, walking gently out of one era and into another. By now, humans had fully spread across the continents. The world was a human world, still wild, still raw in places, but known. In Australia, the First Nations people lived in deep relationship with the land. Their Dreamtime stories, stretching back over 50,000 years, wove geography and memory into one. A river was not just water. It was a path walked by a creator being, a songline to be remembered in verse. Caves were not just shelter. They were living maps, ancestral passageways, songbooks etched in stone. In the Americas, cultures blossomed in diverse and rich ways. On the coast of Peru, the people of Caral, over 4,000 years ago, built step pyramids, plazas, and intricate irrigation systems. And yet, they left no signs of warfare. Their society, born in the twilight of the Stone Age and the dawn of the urban world, seemed to value music, trade, and ritual more than conquest. Their instruments, flutes made from bird bones, still play today. Their pyramids still rise under the stars. Quiet reminders that complexity doesn't always come from violence. Farther north, in what is now Louisiana, the builders of Watson Brake and Poverty Point were raising massive earthworks, concentric rings, ridges, mounds, carefully constructed over centuries. This was still the archaic period, long before widespread farming in the region. And yet these works required planning, cooperation, and memory. Thousands of years ago, people who had no metal tools, no wheels, no written language, moved earth by hand, by basket, by will. They did it because it mattered, because it meant something, and that meaning was carried forward, passed from mouth to mouth, as stories sung beneath a sky full of ancestors. And those ancestors, by now, had been honored in countless ways. Around the world, from the stone tombs of Western Europe, to the burial caves of the Levant, to the forested cemeteries of Northern Asia, the care shown to the dead was as rich and varied as the cultures that created it. Some were buried in crouched positions, like sleepers returning to the earth. Others were laid out fully, dressed in fine beads, ochre, feathers. Some were cremated, some placed in tree platforms or underwater graves. Each culture carried its own vision of what death meant, but nearly all of them treated it as passage, not as end. That's one of the most powerful truths about this entire journey. For early humans, life was a circle. Seasons turned. The sun rose, fell, and rose again. A child was born, a parent passed, and a grandchild repeated the same gesture in springtime. Grinding grain, carving wood, singing the same lullaby. Time wasn't a straight line. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat. That's why so many Neolithic monuments are aligned with the sun, solstices and equinoxes, because people needed to feel that rhythm. They didn't want to just mark time. They wanted to live inside it. In Mesopotamia, along the fertile floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates, this desire for rhythm began to take on new form, writing. First not as language, but as marks, tokens, and tallies pressed into clay to record goods, animals, trade. These were agricultural societies now, dependent on surplus, organization, storage. But what began as accounting slowly transformed. Symbols became cuneiform, numbers became names, and names became stories. Gilgamesh, Inanna, the flood, the gods. Myth was now written in clay, no longer reliant on firelight and memory. A page had turned. But even as writing emerged, even as bronze tools spread, even as cities grew taller and trade routes stretched farther, the soul of the Stone Age endured in places we often overlook. In the rural highlands, where people still lived close to the earth. In the mountain valleys, where shepherds passed stories by voice. In the craft of hands that still knew how to shape flint, even when metal was an option. Change came slowly, unevenly, not as a revolution, but as an evolution. In some regions, people resisted change entirely. Metal was known but not adopted. Farming was possible but not chosen. These weren't backward choices. They were informed, strategic, cultural. The Inuit, the San, the Hadza, the Ainu, the Papuan Highlanders. They adapted not by copying other ways, but by refining their own. They held on to the ancient knowledge, not because they were stuck in the past, but because the past still worked. And even in the rising civilizations, Stone Age practices remained part of daily life. Grinding stones were still used for flour. Stone tools were still used in rituals. Caves were still visited for initiation, solitude, vision. The transition was not a door slammed shut. It was a long sunset. And within that fading light, the old wisdom was never fully lost. That wisdom lives on today, in the way we gather, in the way we grieve, in the comfort we take in firelight, in our instinct to reach for patterns, to make symbols, to share stories late into the night. You, lying there, listening. You are part of that line. You are not separate from the caveman. You are the caveman, just dressed in new skin, speaking new words, looking at stars from a different rooftop. Let that settle in your bones for a moment. Let it remind you that you are ancient, that you are not lost in this world. Even when it feels too fast, too loud, too strange, somewhere deep in your memory, deeper than thought, there is still the sound of stone on stone, the feel of earth under bare feet, the scent of smoke in your hair. You carry them with you. You always have. Now that we've walked so far together, deeper than most ever go, it feels like we're not just telling a story about the past anymore. We're living in it, breathing the same slow, deliberate air our ancestors once did. And maybe that's the point. This isn't history in the dry, dusty sense. It's not a museum display behind glass. It's something alive, humming in the quiet places of your mind, finding its way through your body as you listen. This is the feeling of prehistory, not just its facts, but its presence. By the time the Stone Age was nearing its close, humans had become astonishingly adaptive. There was no single way to be human. In one valley, people carved idols from wood and bone. In another, they fished the same river their ancestors had for millennia. Some built large settlements, others moved with the seasons. But all of them carried memory forward, through gestures, through stories, through rituals passed hand to hand. In many places, the transition to metal wasn't even about replacing stone. It was about adding another tool to the belt. Quite literally. A farmer in the Caucasus might use a copper sickle in the field and still carry a flint knife at the hip. A hunter in Central Europe might wear a bone pendant carved in the old style, while his spearhead gleamed faintly with bronze. Change didn't mean forgetting. It meant folding new ways into old ones. And yet something was shifting, undeniably. As metals became more available, especially bronze, made by mixing copper and tin, the scale of human life began to grow. Bronze tools were stronger, more efficient. They allowed for more wood to be cut, more land to be cleared, more construction to take place. With that came population growth. With population came organization, and with organization came hierarchy. The social fabric was changing. In the Neolithic and Mesolithic world, leadership had likely been fluid. The elder who knew the land best, or the hunter with the sharpest eye, or the healer whose touch always soothed. But now, with permanent food stores, with land ownership, with inherited goods and names, some families began to hold more power than others. We see it in the burials, richer goods, exclusive materials, symbols of authority like staffs, scepters, ornate weapons. But this was not yet the tyranny of kings. These were the first tremors of structure, the slow stacking of roles, layers, systems. And with that complexity came a powerful human need: explanation. Why did the river flood this year? Why did the crops fail? Why did a child fall ill? Why did the sun disappear behind the mountains, but always return? Into that hunger for meaning came myth. Not just scattered tales anymore, but systems, pantheons, ritual calendars, archetypes. The first gods were not so different from the ancestors, spirits of place, of storm, of stone. But over time, they grew names, forms, relationships. The sun and moon became siblings or lovers. The sea, a jealous mother. The mountain, an old warrior. Myth turned the chaos of the world into a story humans could live inside. And where there were myths, there were rituals, performed not in passing, but with precision. Sacrifices, dances, fasts, offerings, masks, fires lit and extinguished at just the right moment. These rituals didn't just celebrate the world, they helped sustain it. People believed that if the right words were said, the right gestures made, the crops would grow, the rains would come, the dead would stay peaceful, the future would arrive, just as it should. In this way, the end of the Stone Age wasn't just a technological shift, it was an emotional one, a spiritual one. People were dreaming bigger, imagining longer. Their communities no longer existed solely to survive. They now existed to belong, to a land, a story, a lineage, a world that stretched far beyond one lifetime. We see this belonging in the way land was marked. Boundaries began to appear. Stone walls, ditches, enclosures. Not always for defense, but for definition. This field was ours. This forest was where the spirits live. This hill was where the ancestors were buried. And no one walks there without asking. It was subtle but profound. The world was no longer just open space. It was mapped, not with ink, but with memory. Even the tools began to reflect this sense of meaning. In Scandinavia, polished stone axes were created so perfectly, so beautifully, that many may never have been used. Some were buried, some broken on purpose. These were not for farming or felling trees. They were sacred objects, offerings, perhaps, or symbols of status. A reminder that even as metal came into use, stone still held power, spiritual power, ancestral power. And for those who still shaped stone, who knapped, drilled, ground, and polished, the craft remained an act of precision and pride. The final generations of Stone Age toolmakers were not holding on to something outdated. They were mastering an art that had shaped the entire human story. Each flake struck from a core was part of a lineage thousands of years old. Each arrowhead was a whisper from the past, given form again in the present. So now, as you lie there, slowly settling into the stillness of this night, you are closer to these people than you might think. Their world was quieter, yes, simpler, maybe. But they too lay under stars, listening. They too thought about the future. They too remembered those who had come before. And they too told stories long into the dark, not because they needed entertainment, but because they needed connection. And that's what we're doing here, connecting, you and me, across time, across breath, across a story that began before fire had a name. Here in the calm of the night, where the silence feels softer than sleep, and the story keeps unfolding like a fire just barely flickering, we're now standing at the edge of something new. You can feel it, can't you? The air is heavier, more aware. We've walked with stone in our hands for so long, traced symbols in caves, buried our kin beneath hearths and hills, watched the moon pass through the branches, and now, with the first sparks of metal rising from the earth, the path of human life begins to twist again. But even as the Bronze Age waits ahead like a distant sunrise, the Stone Age hasn't truly let go. It never does. Some stories are too deeply rooted to be erased. Let's begin again, not with bronze, but with memory. Because even as new tools appear, people still lean into the old rhythms. They continue to burn offerings, to leave carved stones at riverbanks, to tie knots in twine as prayers. And in the sacred spaces, the caves, the cairns, the circles of stone, rituals continue. In western France, burial mounds known as tumuli were built with long chambers and passageways, their walls etched with spirals, axes, and mysterious lines. Some may have been maps, others, prayers, others echoes of visions no longer spoken aloud. These markings weren't for decoration. They were language, not words, but meaning. And meaning, by now, had many layers. In the early cultures of the British Isles, communities gathered not just to hunt or harvest, but to perform. Festivals, perhaps seasonal, drew hundreds of people. Stonehenge, which you might know mostly by its massive outer stones, began its life much earlier as a circular ditch and bank. Wooden posts marked solstices. Cremated bones were carefully buried. Generations later, the stones were added, pulled across miles by teams who sang or chanted or prayed as they moved them. This was more than construction. It was transformation. A land shaped into time, a circle shaped into memory. And nearby, at Durrington Walls, archaeologists have found the remains of feasting. piles of animal bones, broken pottery, traces of long abandoned fires. These people didn't just build, they celebrated. They came together not only in labor, but in joy. The Stone Age, often imagined as harsh and solitary, was also full of laughter, of music, of shared meals, and slow dances around low fires. We forget that sometimes, but it's there, buried in the soil, waiting. Elsewhere, the thread of continuity weaves on. In the deep forests of Europe, groups like the funnel-beaker culture continued to blend farming with hunting and foraging. Their pottery, elegant and flared, showed not just utility, but artistry. They built dolmens, large stone burial chambers, often covered by earth. These were not simple graves. They were statements. The dead did not disappear. They remained among the living, honored, remembered, protected. Life and death weren't opposite ends of a line. They were doors on the same house. Further south, along the Mediterranean, cultures were shifting in other ways. In the Cycladic Islands, marble figurines began to appear. Sleek, stylized, hauntingly modern in their form. Most are female, arms crossed, eyes closed, faces calm. Some were placed in graves, others found in settlements. Their purpose remains uncertain. Were they goddesses, ancestors, or just a reflection of beauty, carried in the hands of someone who wanted to remember a face, a body, a presence? Sometimes the silence of the past is its own language. And across the great steppe lands, stretching from Europe into Central Asia, new kinds of movement emerged. Nomadic herders began to dominate. People of the Yamnaya and other cultures, riding horses, guiding cattle, moving with the seasons. They lived in tents, carried stories with them, built kurgans, burial mounds for their dead. Inside, the bodies were buried with care, along with tools, weapons, and symbolic goods. These were travelers, but not lost. Their world was wide, and their memory long. You can almost see it now, can't you? This strange, beautiful moment in human history, not yet ancient, but no longer stone-bound. A boy walking down a dirt path with a stone axe on his belt and a copper pendant around his neck. A woman grinding grain outside a house built by her grandmother, singing a song older than anyone can remember. A fire burning beside a standing stone, as people raise cups and remember someone whose name is only spoken during moonrise. The Stone Age isn't ending, it's layering. And in this layering, humans are becoming something new. Not more advanced, but more interconnected. Trade routes span hundreds of miles. Obsidian from Anatolia ends up in the Balkans. Amber from the Baltic washes up in Mycenaean tombs. Shells from the Red Sea appear in the Nile Valley. No internet, no roads, just the old paths walked by generations, carried by story, guided by memory, and memory, by now, is sacred. You don't forget where the best reeds grow, where your ancestors' bones rest, where the spirits walk after dark. The earth itself holds memory in its rivers, its stones, its shadows. People of the late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic, the Copper Stone Age, weren't clinging to the past. They were the past. They were its vessel. And we, even now, carry that same thread. So if you're lying there tonight, listening, maybe drifting, maybe dreaming, and wondering what any of this means for you, the answer is everything. The way you value warmth, the way your heart responds to rhythm, the comfort of circles, of ceremony, of repetition, the way stories quiet your breath, that all comes from here, from the long echo of stone, here in the stillness, in the place between waking and sleep. The story begins to deepen again, not because it grows more complex, but because it grows closer. We've traveled far together, through firelight and bone tools, across glaciers and grasslands, through the silence of caves and the rhythm of riverbanks. Now we stand at the quiet doorway between two ages, one shaped by stone, the other beginning to shimmer with metal. But the threshold isn't a line, it's a fog, where old and new blur, and the soul of the world as the ancients knew it still speaks through every flicker of fire and every worn path underfoot. By now, the people of the late Stone Age, or what archaeologists call the Neolithic and Chalcolithic, are living in vibrant, living cultures. These are not the before pictures of history. They are complete in their own right. In the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians have not yet built their pyramids, but their ancestors are already shaping their land. They tend crops, domesticate cattle, build mud brick homes, and prepare the ground for what will one day become the most enduring civilization on Earth. But they do it with flint knives and stone grinders, not yet with chisels and hieroglyphs, and they bury their dead with care, facing west toward the setting sun, because even now, death is not an end, but a journey. In Central and Eastern Europe, the Cucubeni Trapilia culture flourishes. Their settlements grow enormous, some covering hundreds of acres, with concentric rings of homes laid out like a great breathing organism. These people paint their pottery with swirling designs, red and black and white, spirals, eyes, serpents. They place figurines in their homes, perhaps gods, perhaps mothers, perhaps something more abstract. They burn entire villages, ceremonially, after years of occupation, and then build anew on the same ground. Why? No one knows. But it's clear this was not chaos. It was ritual, a pattern, a way of acknowledging time, change, and the breath of the land. Meanwhile, in the highlands of modern-day Iran, the early Elamites begin to work metal with more confidence. Small copper tools, jewelry, bowls, the glint of something new in the dust. And yet side by side, flint still chips away from core stones, still shaped with ancient skill. The two worlds coexist, not in conflict, but in conversation. Metal doesn't erase stone. It joins it, complements it, expands the vocabulary of what a human hand can make. And across the steppes, a strange blend of speed and depth begins to stir. The horse, long admired and hunted, is now tamed, harnessed, ridden. This single shift reshapes the map of human possibility. People can now move farther, faster. Trade accelerates. Ideas move with hooves pounding over dirt and grass. The Yamnaya culture, emerging from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, begins to migrate in wide sweeping arcs, bringing language, genetics, and customs that will ripple all the way to India, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. These weren't invasions in the modern sense. They were tides, migrations, fusions of blood and memory. And as people spread, so too does belief. In Brittany and Iberia, the megalithic tombs evolve into passage graves, long stone corridors leading to central chambers, often aligned with astronomical events. On the winter solstice, light floods these silent spaces, illuminating symbols carved into the rock, spirals, suns, animals, perhaps ancestors. These places were not just for the dead. They were machines of time, built to connect people with the sky, with their history, with the mystery of being. You can imagine it. A cold morning, breath clouding in the air, a line of people walking toward the hill where the tomb waits, children hushed, elders humming an old melody. They gather, not to mourn, but to remember, to watch the sun touch the chamber, where a long-dead chief or shaman rests, and in that light, feel themselves part of something vast. That feeling, that connection to deep time, is older than writing, older than nations. It's one of the most human things we've ever felt. In the Levant, where farming first took root, new challenges emerge: drought cycles, soil fatigue. As villages grow into towns, the first signs of strain begin to show. Walls are built, not just to keep out wild animals, but other people. The Neolithic, once defined by openness, begins to shape itself into borders. Still, the fires are lit each night. Still, the rituals continue. The stories shift, but they don't disappear. And what of the far corners of the world, those not yet touched by metal or cities? In what is now Siberia, the peoples of the taiga continue their ancient patterns, hunting, fishing, weaving bark into clothing, carving sacred objects from antler. In the islands of the Pacific, navigators read the stars, the swells, the birds. They carry songs that map the ocean. No compass, no script, just voice, just memory. In the rainforests of the Congo, hunter-gatherers walk paths only they know, speak languages born from thousands of years of whispers between trees. These are not untouched places. They are living legacies of the oldest human story. Even today, the descendants of those Stone Age cultures continue to carry their ancestors with them, not as a past to be escaped, but as a truth to be honored. And in a way, you do too. In your rituals, in your dreams, in the comfort of the dark, in your longing for fire and quiet, and something older than the world of screens and noise. That part of you is not modern. It is eternal. So if you're feeling it now, the heaviness behind your eyes, the way your breath is slower, the way the world around you has faded to nothing but this voice and this story, you're not drifting off. You're returning to a place where time is soft, where memory lives in stone, and where your spirit still walks barefoot on the earth. By this point, around 3000 BCE in some places, the distinction between the Stone Age and what follows becomes more academic than lived. The so-called Chalcolithic, the Copper Stone Age, is a liminal space. People still sleep beside stone hearths, still use flint to strike fire, still carry bone tools alongside their copper ones. It's not a revolution, it's a conversation between materials, a merging of time. But the rhythms of life remain steady, seasonal, spiritual, rooted. In the lands that would become Mesopotamia, great cities rise from the floodplains. Uruk, Eridu, and later Ur. The names themselves sound like echoes. The wheel appears, then writing. But if you look just behind the ziggurats, past the temple priests and market scribes, you'll find the old ways still flickering. Clay figurines of goddesses, so similar to those carved in stone thousands of years earlier. Reed mats woven with the same patterns. Stories that begin not with kings, but with floods and animals, and gods who shaped men from clay. The Stone Age lives in myth, wearing a new mask. To the west, in the Aegean, early Cycladic societies flourish on rocky islands. Their marble idols, simple and abstract, are laid in tombs or kept in homes. The land is harsh, but the sea is generous. Trade begins to ripple outward. Obsidian from Melos, copper from Cyprus, ideas from Anatolia. Yet still, the settlements are small, the people humble. There are no palaces yet, no empires, just communities, families, voices carried on salt wind. And in the forests of northern Europe, longhouses stretch out across the land. These aren't caves, they're homes, carved from trees and thatch, walls darkened with smoke and years. The people here still rely heavily on stone tools. Even as metal trickles in, their megalithic tombs grow more elaborate. Passage graves align with the moon. Stones are lifted not for utility, but for meaning. These weren't built by slaves or rulers. They were built by communities, by consensus, by shared will. There's something powerful about that. About people coming together, not for profit or command, but because they believe in something larger. A season, a spirit, a cycle. In Ireland, Newgrange continues to receive the winter solstice light. In Malta, the temples of Gajarkim and Menajdra are raised, curved like the ribs of a great stone beast. They're older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, but they were never meant to conquer. They were meant to connect, earth to sky, life to death, people to their place in the turning world. And far to the east, in the Indus Valley, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro begin to hum with quiet efficiency. Their streets are laid in grids. They have drainage systems, granaries, courtyards. But again, if you look closely, the old still lives within the new. Beads carved from stone, motifs painted on pottery that echo patterns seen in Neolithic homes 1,000 miles away. There are no grand palaces here, no statues of kings, just houses, workshops, places where people lived and made and remembered. Meanwhile, in sub-Saharan Africa, the Nok culture of what is now Nigeria begins to create terracotta figures. Expressive, mysterious, often hollow-eyed and abstract. These are not tools, they are symbols, perhaps of ancestors, perhaps of spirits. The people still use stone tools, still farm yams and millet, still tell stories in the dust, but something is stirring. The earliest pulse of metallurgy, the first gleam of iron on the horizon, though still centuries away, and always. There are the rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, the Danube, the Indus, the Yellow River. Along them, people settle, plant, raise families. They shape their tools from what's around them. Sandstone, flint, obsidian, bone. They fish, they farm, they pray. They bury their dead with amulets and feathers and stones. They watch the sky. They tell the old stories. The ones about the first fire, the one who tamed the dog, the cave that opened into another world. These are Stone Age stories, and they're still being told. Because you see, the Stone Age never truly ended. It just laid its tools down in new hands. Its spirit of simplicity, of rhythm, of deep respect for the land lingers. Even now, in the way we gather around a fire, in the comfort we take in circles, in the instinct to carve, to mark, to make beauty from the materials at hand, that is the caveman in us. Not the cartoon of clubs and grunts, but the real human. The one who listened more than he spoke, who moved with the land, who watched, who remembered. So lie there now still, with that feeling in your chest, that quiet hum that says you are part of something older than time. The Stone Age didn't end, it became you. Let's sit for a while with those early Bronze Age communities, the ones who still sleep beside stone tools, but have begun to feel the weight of metal in their palms. In the British Isles, stone circles multiply, not just Stonehenge, but hundreds more. Castler Rig, Avebury, the Ring of Brodgar, each one placed with intention, aligned with solstices, lunar cycles, or sacred landscapes. These weren't just calendars. They were conversation points between people and sky, between the living and the dead. They stood in silence, but they spoke volumes. And the people who raised them, they were farmers, herders, traders. They lived in roundhouses, cooked over central hearths, and passed knowledge orally. Their children learned by watching how to twist cord, how to skin a rabbit, how to listen to wind patterns, how to speak to the spirits of the land. No one had a map, yet everyone knew exactly where they were, because they didn't live on the land. They lived with it. Further east, the early Minoan civilization begins to bloom on the island of Crete. Palaces, or communal complexes, like Knossos and Phaistos, begin to take shape. But they're not fortified. The emphasis isn't war, but trade, craft, and ritual. Frescoes on walls show dancing figures, dolphins, leaping bulls. Pottery grows more refined, with swirling marine motifs, octopuses, shells, waves. These images aren't just decoration. They reflect a worldview, one shaped by sea and sky, by motion and balance. Yet even in these rising cultures, the old persists. In small mountain villages far from the palace centers, people still bury their dead with stone tools, still wear pendants made from bones, still sing songs that came from the time before walls. Change is never uniform. It ripples outward like a stone dropped in a pond. Some places catch it quickly, others let it fade and wait for the next ripple. In the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, the Yamnaya and later the corded ware and Andronovo cultures ride and roam, carrying not just goods, but languages, early Indo-European dialects that will eventually branch into Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Celtic, and more. But again, it's not just about horses and wheels. These people bury their dead under kurgans, in flexed positions, sometimes with wagons, weapons, or food. The dead were going somewhere, and they needed to be prepared. That belief, that death was not an ending, but a journey, is one of the oldest, and it stretches far back into the caves of prehistory. And then, far across the ocean, in the Americas, Stone Age lifeways still dominate, not because they're behind, but because they're right for the land. In the Mississippi Valley, people begin to build mound complexes like Watson Break and Poverty Point, shaping Earth into spirals, platforms, and sacred geometry. These places suggest a social complexity that doesn't rely on kings or conquest. People gather, build, trade, and part. Not every civilization rises to rule. Some rise just to remember. In the Pacific Northwest, communities craft intricate tools and ceremonial objects. From wood, stone, shell, totem poles will come later. But already the art of storytelling through material is strong. Salmon runs shape the calendar. Spirits are everywhere, in the cedar tree, the mountain, the fog. This isn't a Stone Age frozen in time. It's a world moving with time in its own way. And then there's the everyday. The small, quiet acts that leave no monuments but shape everything. A mother teaching her child to shape clay. A father telling a story while patching a net. A grandmother humming a melody while weaving grass into a mat. These are the real rhythms of human life. And they haven't changed. You still do this. Not with clay or nets, maybe, but you hum. You share stories. You teach without realizing it. The Stone Age is still in you. Every time you pass something forward. Even the tools we carry today echo back. A smartphone, sleek and glassy, isn't so far from a polished flint hand axe. One fits in a pocket, the other in a palm. Both are shaped to our needs. Both carry information. Both are symbols of connection. We think we've changed, but we're still using our hands, still shaping the world around us to carry fire. And as we prepare to move on, remember this. The story of the caveman isn't about something primitive. It's about being present. About living in sync with the land, honoring the dead, tending the fire, and knowing when to speak and when to listen. Those are not ancient traits. They are eternal ones. So stay here a little longer in that warmth, in that slow rhythm. Feel the quiet wisdom behind your breath, and let the long night carry you. Not into sleep, but into remembering. You are not far from the fire. You never were. Let's return for a moment to the places where stone still ruled, long after metal had been discovered elsewhere. In regions like Scandinavia, the people of the Nordic Stone Age, sometimes called the pitted ware culture, continued to live much as their ancestors had. They fished, hunted seals, carved tools from bone and antler, and left behind beautiful ceramics marked with small indentations, little fingerprints of identity pressed into clay. These weren't lesser people. They weren't behind. They were simply in tune with their place. Metal wasn't necessary. The ocean fed them. The forest sheltered them. The sky told time. That was enough. And in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, stone axes remained in use well into the 20th century. Not as a failure to modernize, but because the knowledge embedded in those tools had been refined for thousands of years. Obsidian was traded across islands. Fire was made from friction, not because there wasn't a matchstick, but because it was cultural, sacred. The fire was alive. It wasn't just heat, it was history. As metal seeped into some societies, it often arrived first as a symbol, not a tool. A small copper blade worn around the neck, a polished bead shimmering faintly in the sun. These objects were more than functional. They were magical. They came from the earth, but had been changed by fire. That transformation held deep spiritual weight. To hold metal was to hold mystery. But stone still had its place, especially in the sacred. In burial sites across Europe, like those of the Bell Beaker culture, both stone and metal goods are found together. A dagger of bronze, a wrist guard of stone, an arrowhead of flint beside a copper cup. These graves weren't about utility, they were about identity. A person buried with such care was being remembered. not just as a farmer or warrior, but as a soul, a being whose journey did not end with death, but began anew. And that belief in life beyond the visible world? It threads through everything in these final centuries of the Stone Age. In the temples of Malta, great stone structures rise with curved walls and soaring ceilings. Some chambers are acoustically tuned, meaning, if someone speaks or sings within, their voice reverberates, echoes, seems to come from somewhere other. This wasn't accidental. It was design. A way to speak with the divine. A way to reach the dead. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the early mound-building cultures continue to shape the land with precision and purpose. The people who lived at Poverty Point moved earth by hand, creating massive ridges and concentric arcs. These formations may have been calendars, gathering places, or ceremonial grounds, maybe all three, but the effort alone tells us something vital. These were people with a sense of future. They knew that what they built would outlast them, and they wanted it to. There's something deeply human about that. The desire to leave something behind, a mark, a memory, a message. That's what the Stone Age gave us. More than anything else, the sense that we belong to something greater than ourselves. That time is not just a clock, but a circle. That the hands that shaped a flint blade long ago are not strangers, but part of your lineage. You might never make a fire by rubbing sticks together. You might never carve a tool from bone, but you still light candles, still gather in circles, still hold keepsakes, still whisper to the night when no one else is listening. That is the caveman in you. Not some primitive brute, but a person of feeling, memory, ritual. And let's not forget the children of those times. The ones who learned not from schools, but from presence. A child who watched their parent paint a symbol on a stone wall and asked, "Why that shape?" A child who learned to find berries by the taste of the leaves, who remembered stories by rhythm and repetition. These children carried the world forward. Without them, nothing would have endured. And here you are now, carrying the story forward again, listening, absorbing, remembering. Somewhere in you, an ancient fire still burns. Quiet, unshakable. You don't have to go back to the Stone Age to feel it. You just have to sit still, to breathe, to listen. Because the earth hasn't forgotten, and neither have you. The last echoes of the Stone Age are filled not with endings, but with transformations. In Central Europe, the people of the bell-beaker culture stretch across the continent. They are mobile, connected by shared pottery styles and burial customs, but diverse in language and practice. Their bell-shaped vessels, simple yet elegant, are placed with care in graves, often beside archers, tools, beads. The graves are individual now, not communal as they once were. This tells us something subtle but important. Identity is becoming more personal, more defined. The shift from tribe to self is beginning. And yet the old ways still linger in the corners of these new customs. The flint tools laid beside copper daggers, the red ochre sprinkled over the body, the posture of the dead flexed or laid on their sides, eyes facing east toward the rising sun or west toward the setting light. These were not arbitrary. They were ritual. Not for the living, but for the journey beyond. A world they couldn't see, but still believed in with every fiber of their being. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Los Miliares culture constructs fortified hilltop settlements. Theirs is a world of stone walls and copper smelting, of round houses and collective tombs. But inside those tombs, the bones are painted, the grave goods carefully arranged, and the architecture shaped like a womb. It's a return to the earth, not just in death, but in origin, a reminder that life is circular. We come from the ground, we go back to it, and in between, we shape it with our hands, our stories, our rituals. Further east, in the Caucasus and the steppe lands beyond, the Sintashta and early Indo-Iranian cultures begin to shape what will one day become vast mythologies. Chariots appear, bronze weapons, fortified settlements. The sky becomes a god. Fire becomes sacred, but even here, in this dawn of new complexity, you find echoes of the Stone Age, in the burial mounds, in the offerings of food and drink to the dead, in the way a stone tool is still tucked into a child's grave, long after metal has become common, because stone was never just material, it was memory. To leave a flint blade in a grave was not about usefulness, it was about continuity, a reminder that even as the world shifted, certain things remained solid, sharp, true. And what of the women of the Stone Age? So often overlooked in popular stories, but so essential in reality. They gathered, foraged, shaped clay, wove textiles, cured hides, bore children, guided rituals. They were knowledge keepers, herbalists, shamans, artists. Their hands made homes, made tools, made stories last. In many early societies, figurines with exaggerated female features weren't just fertility symbols. They were symbols of presence, of power, of continuity. The earth was seen as feminine, not because of gender roles as we know them today, but because she gave life, and that life returned to her. The first farmers, more often than not, were women. They were the ones who noticed which seeds sprouted, which grains grew strongest. They passed that knowledge to daughters and sons. Farming didn't start as conquest. It started as observation, as patience, as care. And care is what truly defined the Stone Age. In the way a body was laid to rest, in the way food was shared, in the way stories were told the same way, every night for centuries. You don't build stone circles, paint cave walls, or carve beads unless you care. Even as metal tools began to spread, as city walls rose, as names and roles began to harden into systems, the old care continued. We see it in the way communities still gathered to feast, in the way fire remained at the heart of the home, in the songs that didn't disappear, but simply took on new rhythms. And what of the land itself, the ground we've walked this whole way? It holds the memory of the Stone Age in every layer. Beneath the modern cities, and the fields, and the highways, the earth is still cradling bone and stone, still holding the marks of ancient fires, the pollen of long-vanished plants, the footprints of a child who chased a bird across the wet clay floor of a cave 15,000 years ago. That child is still with us. That moment has never fully left. You are walking on memory, always. Sleeping on it. Living inside it. And in that sense, the Stone Age didn't end. It just changed clothes. It stepped quietly into the future, carrying with it everything that mattered: fire, story, family, death, love, the shape of hands pressed into clay, the hum of meaning beneath every action. You are the continuation of all of it, not apart from prehistory, but of it. Now breathe. Feel the weight of that history settle gently over you. Not heavy, but comforting, like a thick hide drawn over your shoulders on a cold night. You are part of something vast, and it is still unfolding. Let's return to the earth for a moment. Not the world map, but the dirt itself. In every patch of land touched by human hands, there are layers, not just of soil, but of memory. Archaeologists call them strata. We might just call them stories. At the bottom, you find stone tools, the first tools, the ones made by breaking one rock against another, striking sparks of intention into existence. Above that, you find bone needles, pigment-stained shells, fire pits ringed with soot, then pottery, then burial grounds, then walls, then cities. But through it all, the stone remains, always the stone. In the high Andes of South America, even as complex societies were beginning to emerge, long before the Inca, people still turned to stone for their sacred work. Petroglyphs carved into cliff faces, trails lined with stone markers, guiding pilgrims toward mountains they believed were gods. The stone wasn't just building material, it was alive. To shape it was to speak to something older than yourself. In Africa, across the Sahel and into the southern regions, hunter-gatherers, herders, and early agriculturalists lived in what archaeologists sometimes call deep continuity. That is, life ways that change, but never break. Some of the tools found in these areas are indistinguishable from ones made 10,000 years earlier. Not because of ignorance, but because of wisdom. These were tools that worked, designs honed through time, passed from hand to hand with quiet respect. Not everything old needs to be replaced. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered. And in the frozen north, in what is now Siberia, communities carved spirit figures from antler and mammoth ivory. They buried their dead with red ochre, with beads, with care, and always, always, with a sense that death was a crossing, not a collapse, that somewhere on the other side, the fire still burned. Maybe that's why they sent people off with food, with tools, with songs sung softly as the earth closed over them. Even the rise of cities, what we often call civilization, didn't erase these beliefs. It layered over them. In ancient Sumer, in the earliest written texts, we find echoes of older myths, gods made from clay, serpents of the underworld, spirits tied to the desert wind. These weren't invented overnight. They were inherited, whispered forward from campfire to courtyard to temple wall. The caveman didn't vanish. He became a storyteller in robes, a priest with a stylus, a mason who carved the same spiral his great-grandmother once painted in ochre on a cave wall. And what of the forest people, the river people, the desert people, the ones who never built walls or wrote names in clay? Their traditions endured in song and movement, in tattoo, in drumbeat, in the careful teaching of plant names and sky signs. In some indigenous communities today, elders can still trace lineages back 100 generations, not through paper or data, but through story. That kind of memory doesn't grow out of nowhere. It's rooted in the Stone Age, in the understanding that knowledge isn't owned, it's carried. As time passed, and the Bronze Age spread its networks across the world, stone slowly took its place in the background, but it never disappeared. In fact, in times of great change, when societies fell, when cities burned, when empires collapsed, people returned to the old ways. Flint, fire, family. When the world gets too loud, we go quiet. And the Stone Age in many ways was the quietest part of our history, but also the most resilient. And maybe that's why it still comforts us. Why stories like these help you sleep. They come from a time before clocks, before headlines, before screens and signals and deadlines. Back when the only light was firelight, and the only noise at night was the wind, and the stories passed from mouth to mouth. There was a kind of peace then, not because life was easy, but because it was understood. It had rhythm, it had ritual, and even pain had a place, a name, a context. There is a lesson there, a reminder that you don't need to own the world to belong in it, that walking barefoot across a familiar path, picking herbs your grandmother once taught you about, or humming a song your parents sang, these are acts of continuity, of strength. And those acts began long ago with the ones we call cavemen. Though they never called themselves that, they didn't need a label, they had each other, the land, the fire, and that was enough. So tonight, as you drift further into sleep, let yourself be held by that idea that you are not rootless, you are not lost, you are part of something vast and old and sacred. The world was shaped by hands like yours, by minds like yours, by hearts that beat the same slow rhythm you feel now. The Stone Age, even in its final twilight, held on to something precious that we often lose today: presence. People lived close to the land, to each other, to the slow rhythms of season and soil. A single day wasn't packed with noise and movement. It had weight. A meal took time. A walk wasn't hurried. Conversations happened face to face, over coals or beneath trees, and every word mattered because there was no recording it, only remembering it. Let's imagine, together, a small settlement during this late Neolithic world. It's early spring. The snow has melted. The earth is damp and fragrant. In the center of the village, a group of elders is repairing the roof of a communal building, a place for stories, Rituals, rest. Children are helping too, weaving reeds into bundles, watching, learning, not with lessons but with their hands. There is no teacher, only time, only repetition, only the knowledge that if you do the same thing every year, with care, the roof will hold. Elsewhere in the same village, a woman grinds grain with a stone. She's used her entire life. Her mother used it before her, and when her daughter is old enough, she'll take it on. The grooves in the rock are like fingerprints, not just tools, inheritance. Objects that carry memory, not just utility. And outside the settlement, further in the trees, someone is carving, not with a bronze blade, but with obsidian. He's making a pendant, maybe for trade, maybe for a coming-of-age gift, maybe to be buried with someone he loved. The carving isn't rushed. He hums while he works, and when he's done, he polishes the surface with animal fat, holds it to the sun and smiles. A small thing, maybe, but beautiful. That's what the Stone Age left us, a world full of small, slow beauty. Even in regions where metal had taken hold, the stone was still sacred. Obsidian blades were often used in ceremonial contexts, even when bronze or copper were available. Why? Because obsidian cuts with surgical precision, because it comes from fire, volcanic stone, because it feels old, ancient, real. In Mesoamerica, long after bronze tools arrived, obsidian remained the preferred blade for ritual sacrifice. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about respect, tradition, continuity. And in the highlands of Anatolia, in the shadow of the mountains, where some of the first farming communities arose, people still used stone querns to grind their flour. They still dug storage pits lined with clay. They still decorated their homes with red ochre, spirals, and the occasional horned altar. These homes weren't just shelters. They were extensions of the body, warm, earthy, shaped by hand. To walk into one was to enter a memory, a womb, a promise. Meanwhile, on the vast steppes, new ways of life were forming. The horse had changed everything. People could move farther, faster, carry more. The wheel followed, wagons, carts, portable hearths. But even as mobility increased, the old rituals held firm. Fire remained central. Graves still faced the dawn. Ancestors were still spoken of as if they were nearby, because they were, in stories, in songs, in the shape of a path taken the same way every year. And in places where forests still dominated, in the deep woods of Central Europe, the taiga of Northern Asia, the highland jungles of Southeast Asia, people kept to the old ways, not because they didn't know of metal, but because the stone and the spirit were enough. It wasn't a lack of progress. It was resistance to forgetting. The stories passed in those forests are some of the oldest still spoken, myths of animals who speak, trees who remember, mountains who sleep. These aren't fairy tales. They're echoes of the world when it was still new, when humans had to listen before they acted, when the earth was not a resource, but a relative. And even now, in your own quiet, in your own moments of slowness, you feel that pull. It's why you're here, listening, breathing in rhythm with something you can't name. You don't need to know every date, every archaeological layer, every theory. You already know the most important part, that you come from people who watch the sky with reverence, who shaped their world with patience, who held silence not as emptiness, but as a kind of sacred space. So let's hold that space a little longer. Don't rush. Let this part of the story settle like ash after fire. Soft, fine, necessary. Let it coat your thoughts, not with heaviness, but with grounding. Let it remind you that you are not made of numbers or noise. You are made of rhythm, of circles, of warmth. You are part of the oldest story ever told. In the years we now call the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, the world didn't become unfamiliar. It simply grew more layered. A child born in a stone house could grow up wearing copper jewelry. A funeral might involve both obsidian blades and bronze offerings. Stone circles stood silent while metal tools cleared forests around them. The line between ages wasn't a wall, it was a field, and people moved across it every day. In the fertile lands of the Danube Valley, longhouses dotted the rolling green hills. Made from timber and thatch, they were homes, workshops, gathering places. Entire extended families lived in one structure. 3, sometimes 4 generations together. The hearth at the center was more than warmth. It was a witness. It saw births, deaths, arguments, celebrations. And when a house was finally abandoned, sometimes it was ritually burned, not out of anger, but reverence, to release the spirit of the place, to begin again, farther east, in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. Massive burial mounds known as kurgans rose like watchful eyes over the land. Some contained chariots, armor, drinking vessels, weapons, but others held more tender things: combs, dolls, woven textiles. They remind us that these were not just warriors or traders. They were people. People who grieved. People who remembered. People who wanted to send their dead off with something familiar. Something that might make the journey less lonely. And in Britain, a man was buried near Stonehenge, his grave filled with rare and finely crafted goods. His teeth revealed he had come from the Alps. He had traveled far, and when he died, he was laid to rest among the stones. They called him the Amesbury Archer. Perhaps he was a metalworker, a dignitary, a traveler who brought new ways. But he was buried with both gold and stone. His story sits at the crossroads of 2 worlds, and even in death, he seemed to honor both. Meanwhile, in the lush valleys of the Yellow River in China, Neolithic societies were giving way to the earliest dynastic stirrings. But the bones of oracle rituals, burned and read for signs from the ancestors, had been used for generations already, carved with symbols, then cracked in fire. These bones were more than tools. They were conversations with the past, with the spirit world, with the patterns that underpinned all life. And there, once again, we find the essence of the Stone Age: relationship, a sense that the world wasn't just filled with objects and events, but with beings, rhythms, forces that required listening, respect, balance. You didn't conquer the mountain, you left an offering before climbing. You didn't kill the deer thoughtlessly, you thanked it, spoke to it, perhaps danced in its honor. This kind of relational living, where everything has presence, everything is part of a living web, is not gone. It lingers in indigenous lifeways, in animist beliefs, in the quiet instincts we all still carry. The urge to whisper in sacred places, to pause before entering an old forest, to feel a shiver in the presence of silence. That's not superstition, that's memory, ancient memory, humming through your bones. In the far north, where the winters were long and the nights endless, the Sami people of Scandinavia followed reindeer herds and carried songs through the snow. Their drums weren't just for rhythm, they were for navigation, for prophecy. Their joiks, haunting, repetitive chants, weren't about people, but of people, of animals, of rivers. Each song was a presence, not a story. To sing was to remember, to connect, to live alongside the world instead of outside it. And in the Pacific, the Lapita people set sail across vast stretches of open ocean, guided by the stars, the birds, the waves. They brought with them pottery styles, languages, ancestors. Every island they landed on was made home not through conquest but through pattern. They planted, they built, they buried their dead, and they sang the names of the places they left behind. You can still hear those songs today if you know where to listen. But maybe the greatest monument of the Stone Age is not a temple, or a burial, or a carved figure. Maybe it's something smaller. Maybe it's a handprint on a cave wall. One of many, placed side by side, blowing ochre pigment through hollow reeds. A line of hands, fingers spread wide, forever reaching, frozen in red and black. They didn't sign them. They didn't explain them. They didn't need to. Because those hands say, I was here, and now you are too. So breathe deeply. Let the fire burn low again. You're halfway between then and now, between waking and sleep. And everything you've heard so far, all of it, still lives in you. The voice, the fire, the silence. Imagine the earliest mornings of humanity. Before clocks, before borders. A village waking with the sun, slowly, with no need for urgency. Smoke curling from thatched roofs. The sound of grain being ground between stones. The soft coo of birds returning to the trees. These scenes didn't vanish with time. They stretched, they endured. In countless places around the world, they still happen. Because some ways of being are too natural, too human, to ever fully disappear. In the Balkans, in the late Neolithic settlements of Lepenski Vir, people built trapezoidal houses, perfectly aligned with the river. Their floors were often covered in lime plaster, their hearths carefully placed. But most curious of all were the stone sculptures they left behind. Human faces merged with fish, carved with wide staring eyes. These weren't decorations. They were guardians, or ancestors, or spirits of the river. They remind us that the Stone Age didn't divide the natural and the supernatural. It wove them together. And in Japan, the Jomon people lived for thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, with some of the most intricate pottery in the ancient world. Their vessels are not simple or crude. They twist and curve, with flaring rims and rope-like impressions. Some were functional, others ceremonial, and all of them are evidence of a culture that valued beauty, continuity, and detail. Even without agriculture, the Jomon remind us that sophistication does not depend on crops or cities. It depends on care. Elsewhere, in the rainforests of the Congo Basin, forager cultures moved in fluid patterns, shaped not by territory, but by trust. Trust in the land, in each other, in the rhythm of seasons. The forest was not feared, it was known. Each tree, each bird call, each scent of distant rain had meaning. These people sang, played instruments made from leaves, hunted with nets woven in communal effort. Their tools may have been stone, but their society was as intricate as any empire, just written in footsteps and canopy, not in stone and script. And then there's the matter of language, spoken long before it was written, evolving with every generation, not through decree, but through sound and use. The first names for animals, rivers, stars. The first stories told beside the fire. The lullabies, the warnings, the jokes. Language was not invented, it emerged. And even now, every word you speak carries the echo of those first conversations in the dark. Every syllable you hear has ancestors. In the deserts of Australia, Aboriginal peoples maintained complex dreamtime stories that mapped their entire world spiritually, historically, ecologically. These stories were not myths in the modern sense. They were instructions, not just of how the world came to be, but of how to live in it. Each rock formation, each waterhole, each animal track had a song, a story, a meaning. These oral maps were passed on through performance, song, dance, gesture, and some of them are still told today, tens of thousands of years later. That's not survival, that's mastery. And what about art? So often dismissed in discussions of prehistory, as if it were something separate. But art was everywhere, carved into bone, etched into cliffs, painted onto bark, sewn into hides, carried as amulets. Art was not a luxury, it was a language, a way to mark a life, honor a moment, protect a soul. Even in the hardest times when food was scarce, or winters harsh, people still made things, not because they had extra time, but because the act of making helped them survive. Sometimes it was as simple as a bead, a small piece of stone or shell, pierced and worn around the neck. Think of that. Someone sat down, selected the right piece, carved a hole with another stone, smoothed it with care, and strung it on sinew. That bead was not just decoration, it was identity, memory, maybe love. And isn't that still true today? A bracelet passed down, a note tucked in a pocket, a stone you picked up on a walk and never threw away. We still live with talismans, still look for meaning in the small and tactile. That's not modern nostalgia, that's prehistoric instinct. Because humans have always reached for what they couldn't quite explain. Not just to control it, but to be with it, to honor it. That's the spirit that drove our ancestors to lift stones into circles, to paint deer on cave walls, to whisper over graves. It's the same spirit that brings you here, night after night, to listen, to remember, to connect. And so the journey continues. Not away from the Stone Age, but deeper into its gifts, presence, rhythm, reverence. You're not just learning history, you're returning to something, a way of being that hums quietly beneath all the noise. Close your eyes now, if they aren't already closed. You're not drifting, you're grounding. The ground is where it all began, and it still holds you. The Stone Age didn't disappear. It rooted itself in every generation after. You carry it in your bones, your breath, your heartbeat. Even now, in the dead of night, with this voice wrapping gently around your thoughts, the old rhythm is still playing, the one that pulsed beneath every step your ancestors took as they crossed mountains, rivers, deserts, seas. Let's sit with them for a moment. The last generations of the Stone Age, standing unknowingly at the edge of history's threshold. They didn't think of themselves as part of a before or an after. They just lived. Their lives were not primitive. They were precise. They knew how to track a deer through dry forest, how to predict the first frost by the pattern of clouds, how to soothe a fever with a bitter root pulled from the earth just before dusk. Knowledge passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand, not written, embodied. In the forests of what is now northern Germany and Denmark, the people of the Ertabola culture lived in harmony with the sea. Shell middens, great piles of discarded oysters, mussels, and cockle shells are the remnants of countless meals shared slowly under open skies. Archaeologists find tools, bones, even footprints in the ancient clay. But what you won't find are kings, temples, or written laws. And yet they survived for generations, peacefully, sustainably, with joy perhaps, laughter around the fire, the scent of fish roasting, the sound of wind across water. In other parts of the world, the Neolithic was evolving in its own direction. In Taiwan, early Austronesian peoples began to craft finely polished stone adzes, wide-bladed tools used to shape wood for canoes. These canoes were more than transportation. They were vessels of migration, of identity. These people would later become the great seafarers of the Pacific, carrying language, culture, and memory across unimaginable distances. Their navigation systems relied not on instruments, but on the sky, the sea, and the knowledge held in song. Each island became a verse, each voyage a prayer. And as the Bronze Age gathered momentum in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, the Stone Age quietly continued in the highlands, the forests, the wetlands. In Scotland's Orkney Islands, stone houses still stood strong, thick-walled, low-roofed, built with slabs carefully stacked and fitted. These weren't temporary shelters. They were homes. You can still walk inside them today and feel the presence of those who lived there. The hearths are still blackened with soot. The beds are still carved into the walls. A people so far from us in time, and yet somehow so close. And as always, there were stories, passed from elders to children, told in rhythm, in riddle, in metaphor. In West Africa, grituals, oral historians, carried genealogies, battles, songs, and wisdom forward for centuries, using only their memory and voice. That tradition stretches far back, deep into the Stone Age, before alphabets, before scrolls, when the human voice was the library, the heart, the archive. But not all memory lived in words. Some of it was held in movement, dances that marked the passing of seasons, or the celebration of a birth. Movements performed not for an audience, but for the spirits, for the land. for the ancestors, watching just beyond the firelight. In Aboriginal Australian ceremonies, the body was painted with ochre, and every gesture had meaning. You weren't performing, you were remembering. You were becoming the story. Even today, when you close your eyes and sway to music, when you trace a spiral with your finger on a fogged window, when you hum a melody you don't even realize you know that's the Stone Age singing through you. Not a time of darkness, but of depth, of connection. And here's something you might not expect. Even in the earliest art, tens of thousands of years old, there is evidence of abstract thinking. Symbols repeated across vast distances, grids, crosshatches, zigzags. These weren't random doodles. They were part of a shared visual language, a way of saying, I see what you see, I know what you know. Maybe even, I am not alone. Think of that. A message carried not in paper or code, but in pigment and gesture, across generations. Some of those messages still survive, still visible in caves from South Africa to France, from Indonesia to Argentina, across continents, across ice ages. All of them saying, we were here, and now you are here. Not just as a listener to this story, but as its next keeper. You, with your own rituals, brushing your teeth in the same way every night, placing your phone face down before sleep, whispering goodnight even if no one is there to hear it. You might not be painting on cave walls, but you're still tracing patterns, still marking time, still remembering. The Stone Age lives on in the quiet things, the sacred ordinary, the breath between thoughts, the comfort of rhythm, the love passed silently from one hand to another. So let that love settle into your chest now. Let it rest with you. Let it hold you the way the earth has always held us. In the volcanic highlands of modern-day Ethiopia, where some of the very first humans walked, there is a kind of wind that seems older than the sky. It whistles through rock shelters, through dry grasses, through ancient riverbeds where stone tools still lie, waiting. And that wind, it carries stories, not just of one people or one tribe, but of all of us, because that's where we began. All of us. The caveman wasn't someone else. He was you, just further back in the spiral of time. And in those early homes, whether they were caves or huts of branches and hide, or stone houses built into the hillsides, you would find moments that feel startlingly familiar. Someone sitting cross-legged, carving. Someone humming to a baby. Someone setting down a tool after a long day, watching the sunset, knowing they've earned their rest. These weren't caricatures. They were real lives, real minds, real feelings. We think we've changed so much, but in the most important ways, we've stayed the same. And as we look closer, we begin to see that these people were not just surviving, they were exploring. Not just terrain, but imagination. In the Paleolithic caves of Europe, there are paintings that shimmer with motion. Animals layered in ochre and charcoal, as if galloping across time itself. Some figures have multiple legs, like a stop-motion drawing, capturing movement before film ever existed. Others have human bodies and animal heads, suggesting myth, dream, transformation. These were not doodles, they were visions, and many were drawn deep inside caves, far from light, far from warmth. To reach them meant crawling for hours through narrow, damp corridors, sometimes carrying torches, sometimes crawling through total darkness. They didn't paint for decoration. They painted for meaning, for ritual, maybe for memory, maybe for magic, but always for connection. And isn't that what we still long for today? A way to feel connected to each other, to the land, to something larger than ourselves. You may not be holding a torch in a cave, but here you are, listening in the dark, allowing yourself to drift into something older, something slower. That's what these stories are for. Not information, but orientation. A way to feel at home in time. In the Arctic, the ancestors of the Inuit peoples shaped harpoon heads with stunning precision. They built snow shelters that could hold warmth even in the most bitter cold. They mapped coastlines with driftwood carvings, each notch and groove a story. a guide. No one taught them this in a school. It was passed through experience, through presence, through trust. Knowledge in the Stone Age wasn't taught, it was lived. And in the heart of the Amazon, Stone Age technologies still pulse through the forest. Charcoal layers in the soil, called terra preta, show that humans have been shaping that ecosystem for thousands of years. Not destroying it, but curating it. Planting useful species, encouraging biodiversity. This wasn't a wilderness, it was a garden, designed not with metal or machinery, but with understanding. Everywhere you look, the Stone Age was not a pause in history, it was history, a vast, rich, complex story, unfolding in 1,000 directions at once. And each community, each tribe, each language and tool and ritual was its own kind of brilliance, not primitive, perfected for its place and time. And you're the continuation of that. You are not separate from the past. You are its breath, its memory. You carry its questions, its instincts, its resilience. So when you feel overwhelmed by the present, by the speed, the noise, the confusion, remember this: once, not so long ago, everything was quiet. And in that quiet, people lived lives of meaning and depth. They cooked meals from scratch. They tracked time by stars. They sang while they worked. They watched their children grow by firelight. They didn't hurry. They didn't forget what mattered. And now, neither do you. Let the weight of that truth settle gently over you. Let it hold you in stillness, in warmth. You are not lost. You are exactly where you need to be. In the center of the oldest story, still unfolding. Let's return for a while to the people who lived on the edge, not of survival, but of the land. People of the coasts, the marshes, the islands, the ones who didn't build monuments, but built relationships with tide and moon, with water birds, with fish migrations. In places like the North Sea's Doggerland, a now submerged land bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Stone Age families lived among reed beds and slow rivers. Their tools were made of flint and antler. Their camps moved with the seasons. And though their settlements were eventually swallowed by the sea, their memory remains in fragments of wood, shaped bone, and old fish traps, still preserved under silt. They remind us that nothing and no one is truly lost, not if we remember. In what is now the American Southwest, people known today as the ancestral Puebloans lived in pit houses before they built cliff dwellings. Their early homes were humble, dug into the ground, covered with brush and earth. But inside, there was order. There was ritual. There were niches carved into walls to hold sacred objects. Every corner had meaning. These weren't just homes, they were worlds. Small, sacred reflections of the sky above and the soil below. And across the globe in Siberia, at a site called Durang Guryak, we find evidence of habitation that may stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. A place where early humans chipped stone beneath vast pine canopies, beside rivers thick with ice and silence. That silence was not emptiness. It was respect. It was listening, and the people who lived there knew the language of snow, of moss, of how to find warmth not in fire alone, but in each other. What's astonishing is how far these people traveled. We used to imagine ancient humans as stationary, limited, but no, they moved, not aimlessly, but intentionally, following reindeer, birds, the stars, crossing from Asia into the Americas, across the Bering Land Bridge. They carried with them not just tools and seeds, but memory. The earliest signs of life in South America appear soon after, in caves, in hearths, in the careful arrangement of bones and shells. These weren't people rushing to conquer. They were people carving out harmony, listening for where they could belong. That's a lesson we still struggle to remember today. And always, beneath their feet, the earth listened. Think of the paths they walked, packed down over generations, trodden by bare feet, worn into stone and soil. We call them desire paths today. Those small trails made not by planning, but by instinct. They are the routes people naturally take, and some of them, believe it or not, are still visible. Modern sidewalks sometimes follow ancient trails. Roads mimic migration. Cities are built on meeting places that have been sacred for millennia. There's something powerful in that, to know that your morning walk, your familiar route through the woods or down the street, may echo the steps of someone who lived 10,000 years ago. You are not far removed. You are layered right on top of them, and so many of those early ancestors were caretakers of memory. We often think of shamans or elders as separate from everyday life, but in many cultures, they were one and the same. A grandmother who knew when the birds would return, a man who remembered the shape of the stars at the solstice, a child who could mimic bird calls so well the animals came closer. Everyone had a role. Everyone carried something, even if it was just a story. There were no spectators in the Stone Age. Life required participation. You couldn't just consume, you had to contribute. That didn't mean power or production. It meant presence, listening, offering, observing. That's how wisdom grew, not from controlling, but from tending. And maybe that's what we're really rediscovering here. Not just history, not just archaeology, but the deeper lesson that being human isn't about domination. It's about being in rhythm with each other, with the land, with the invisible currents of time. So breathe with that now. Feel it settle into your chest. You don't have to understand everything. You don't need all the answers. You just need to be still. The story is still being told. And you, quiet, listening, resting, you are part of it, more than part. You are the next verse. The deeper we go into this ancient world, the more we realize the story of the caveman isn't about brutality or fear. It's about relationship. About how humans lived not above nature, but within it. How they read rivers like books, listened to the sky as if it spoke their language, and maybe it did. In what is now southern Turkey, at a place called Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest known proto-cities, people lived in houses built wall to wall, accessed from the rooftops. There were no streets. Instead, people walked across the tops of their homes. A quiet maze of life woven tightly together. Inside, rooms were plastered with images of bulls, leopards, and human forms. Burials happened beneath the floor. You might sleep each night above your grandmother. That wasn't eerie, it was grounding. The past was right there, a literal part of your foundation. And what's remarkable is how egalitarian it seems to have been. There's no clear evidence of kings, priests, or palaces. Tools, decorations, and grave goods were shared across genders. This was not a society ruled by a few. It was shaped by many. And that sense of shared life, of balance, carries the same fingerprint we see again and again in Stone Age cultures around the world. Even in places where hierarchy did develop, it wasn't always based on force. Sometimes it came through wisdom. A person became a leader, not by commanding, but by remembering. Knowing the path to the winter camp, knowing which plant healed a wound, knowing which story to tell when the mood turned fearful. Knowledge was power, but not hoarded, offered. That is a sacred kind of power, the kind that doesn't fade even when its holder does. In the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, seafaring communities navigated not with maps, but with the stars, the swell of the ocean, and the shape of islands known by heart. Their boats, hollowed from tree trunks, lashed with fiber cord, were sturdy enough to cross open ocean, linking islands across vast distances. And in those boats traveled more than people. They carried stories, music, rituals, seeds, tools. The tools were often stone, even when metal had been discovered. Why? Because they worked, because they had meaning, because they were part of the story. In the Americas, long before contact with Europe, complex societies flourished. The Mississippian cultures built earthwork mounds with immense precision, perfectly aligned with solar events. These weren't random piles of dirt. They were calendars, temples, memory keepers. Entire cosmologies lived in the shape of the land, and the people who built them were still using stone tools, even as they mapped the heavens. And this is the beauty of the Stone Age. It's not a story of lack, but of choice, of adaptation, of quiet genius. People used what they needed, not what they could extract endlessly. They lived with cycles, not against them. They left space for silence, for reverence, for the unknown. That's a kind of wisdom we're aching for again, whether we realize it or not. You can feel it in the way you yearn for stillness, for something slow and true. That's why you're here, listening. Not just to learn, but to remember, to reconnect with something the modern world rarely offers. The permission to rest without guilt, to listen without rushing, to exist without proving. Because in the Stone Age, being was enough. Waking up, gathering food, telling stories, watching the stars, loving, losing, continuing. That was life. It still is. And what of dreams? We often forget how vital they were, not just as nightly curiosities, but as messages. In many ancient cultures, dreams were guidance, prophecy, conversation with the spirit world. Some societies had dreamers as part of their leadership, people who could enter the night and return with meaning. The sleeping self was not unconscious. It was closer to the truth, closer to the ancestors, closer to the divine. You might be slipping into dreams now yourself, gently, without even noticing the shift. That's okay. That's what this is for. The world of the caveman isn't something far away and long ago. It's beneath you, around you, within you. And as you drift, the same moon that shone on them shines on you. The same earth holds your body. The same fire glows in your chest. You are part of something timeless. And right now, it is holding you in silence and warmth, because the Stone Age wasn't about beginnings and endings. It was about being, a way of living in tune with the pulse of the earth, not above it. And that rhythm, that deep, patient rhythm, is still inside you. It's in the way you breathe when no one's watching. It's in the way your eyes close when you hear a fire crackle. It's in your bones, your blood, your instincts. You don't need to think about it. You only need to feel. Let's walk again, barefoot and unhurried, across the late Paleolithic grasslands. The morning dew is still clinging to the tips of tall stalks, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. A few figures stir in the distance, gathering firewood, checking traps, whispering softly so as not to wake the others. The air smells like ash and green and breath. This is not a scene from the distant past. This is a human morning, the kind we still live when we allow ourselves to slow down. And in those ancient mornings, the world was not quiet because it was empty. It was quiet because people listened to the birds, to the sky, to the wind moving through leaves in a language older than words. There was no need to fill the silence. The silence meant something. It still does. In Central Asia, where the steppes roll endlessly toward the sky, early nomadic peoples followed the rhythm of the seasons. They moved with herds, set up yurts in the soft soil, heated stones to keep warm at night. Their lives were portable, but not transient. Wherever they were present, a piece of sky overhead, a piece of earth beneath, and always, always, a circle of people, of ritual, of memory. The hearth in the center was more than heat. It was home, even the concept of home as we know it now. 4 walls, doors, locks, is so recent. For most of human history, home was where the people were, where the fire was kept, where your name was remembered. And maybe that's why these stories feel so intimate now, even though they stretch back tens of thousands of years. Because what they're really describing isn't archaeology, and not just to each other, to the world. In ancient coastal regions from the Pacific Northwest to the islands of Oceania, entire ways of life were built around tides, seasons, and stars. People read the sea like a book, knew where the fish would be before they arrived, could look at a cloud and know how many days until rain. Their calendars weren't marked on paper. They were lived, day by day, tide by tide, moon by moon. Their knowledge didn't just help them survive, it helped them feel held by the world, rather than at odds with it. That sense of connection, of being held, is one we all crave, and it's no wonder, because for most of our history, we didn't live alone. We didn't sleep alone. We didn't dream alone. Our ancestors slept side by side, shoulder to shoulder, bodies warm, breath sinking in the dark. And above them, stars turned slowly across the sky, just as they do now. Imagine that, falling asleep under the same sky as those who first shaped flint, who painted the first spirals, who whispered the first stories. Imagine knowing, in your bones, that you are not a mistake, not a disruption, but part of the world's pattern. That's what the Stone Age gave us. That's the story it told, over and over, in every fire lit, every handprint on a cave wall, every burial tucked lovingly into the earth. And even in grief, there was beauty. The tenderness of burial practices, bodies carefully wrapped, sprinkled with ochre, placed with tools, beads, shells, and food, tells us that death wasn't the end. It was a threshold. And the care shown to the dead speaks volumes about how the living saw each other. With reverence, with continuity, with love, those same hands that buried the dead shaped the tools, raised the children, smoothed the stone bowls. They were strong, yes, but also gentle. We forget that part, don't we? We think of strength as hardness, but in the Stone Age, strength also meant patience. It meant sitting with someone until the story was finished. It meant mending the net, even when your fingers hurt. It meant remembering the path, even when it vanished beneath snow. And tonight, as your own breath slows, and the modern world slips further away, you are remembering too. Not with facts or timelines, but with feeling, with stillness, with the quiet certainty that you belong to something much older and deeper than anything you can see. You are not behind time. You are right on time, just like they were. Because long before history books, long before stone temples or bronze swords, there was the simple act of living, of breathing in the cold morning air, of sharing food beside the fire, of feeling another person's shoulder pressed gently against your own as sleep came. That's what our earliest ancestors knew intimately. Life not as noise or ambition, but as presence. And even now, in the hush of this night, you are tapping into that same truth. In the river valleys of what's now central India, Stone Age people lived in rock shelters, carved into the sandstone cliffs. On the walls of those shelters, they painted animals in motion, deer leaping, elephants marching, humans dancing in circles. The images are simple, yet unmistakably alive. Some of them are over 10,000 years old, and yet the joy they convey, the movement, the connection, still radiates through time. It's not the technique that survives. It's the emotion, the impulse to celebrate life, to record it, not with facts, but with feeling. And in the vast savannas of East Africa, the cradle of our species, groups of hunter-gatherers moved with grace across the land. Their knowledge of plants, of weather, of animal patterns was not written down, it was lived, it was embodied. They knew that the moon changed the behavior of the animals. They knew how to read the tracks left in the dust. They knew that everything spoke if you listened long enough. Maybe that's what the Stone Age really teaches us, that wisdom isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with credentials or applause. Sometimes wisdom is sitting still long enough to hear the trees move. Sometimes it's holding silence while a child watches the stars and begins to ask questions that have no answers. And sometimes it's just being, truly being in the world. In Papua New Guinea, highland cultures used polished stone axes as symbols of status in exchange for generations after metal became known elsewhere. Why? Because those axes weren't just tools, they were relationships. They were made with time, with ceremony, and gifted with care. Sometimes they took years to craft. The value wasn't in their usefulness, it was in their meaning. And in that way, they were not so different from a wedding ring. a lullaby, a story told again and again, long after the storyteller is gone. And that's the through line, isn't it? Care. The Stone Age was full of it. Care in how tools were made, how the sick were tended, how the dead were laid to rest. Care in how stories were told, not rushed, not trimmed, but allowed to unfold slowly, like a fire catching in dry moss. That's what we're doing here too, allowing a story to take its time, to live, to rest alongside you. There's a rhythm to it, not just in the telling, but in the listening. The rhythm of your breath, slowing now. The rhythm of your heartbeat, steady and soft. You're part of a chain of listeners, going back beyond names, beyond calendars. You're not hearing this story alone. You're hearing it with them. All those who ever sat by a fire and watched the sparks lift into the night like wishes. And even as the tools changed, from stone to copper, from copper to bronze, that act remained, the gathering, the listening, the slowness. When metal arrived, it didn't erase what came before. It grew from it. A bronze blade still needed to be held by a human hand, still needed fire, still needed time. In fact, in many places, stone and metal coexisted for generations, not because people were behind, but because they were wise. They didn't throw away what worked. They adapted, they combined. They listened to what the land would give and what it would take. And so we begin to see the Stone Age, not as a chapter that ended, but as a foundation that continues. We still live in its shadow, or maybe more truthfully, in its light. You, here now, curled into yourself, eyes closed or drifting, are not separate from that. You are inside the story, carried by it, held. No need to think, no need to try, just rest, just be. Even now, you can almost feel it, the press of bare feet in soft earth, the scent of wood smoke in early morning, the way the world used to glow with presence. That's what the Stone Age gave us. Not simplicity in the sense of lack, but simplicity in the sense of enoughness. They didn't have more than they needed, and they didn't want more than they could carry. Their richness was in each other, in the land, in time itself. Take the high plateaus of Iran, where ancient pastoralists grazed sheep and goats along narrow trails, carved over centuries. They didn't fence off land, they followed its shape. Their homes were built into the curves of hills. Their fire pits dug where wind wouldn't blow the flame. Every decision was made with attention, with humility, with awareness that the earth was not a stage, but a partner. And in northern Scandinavia, the Sami and their ancestors followed reindeer across snow and tundra, knowing the terrain like an extension of their own skin. Their drums carried symbols older than alphabets, maps, spirits, seasons, songs. Each child grew up knowing not just the names of stars, but how they moved, what they meant. Their entire world was relational. Every rock, every animal, every shift in weather was part of a larger conversation, a dialogue between life and land. We lost some of that over time. As metal turned into machines, and words turned into records, and the old trails became asphalt. But not all of it. You still know how to feel the sky change before a storm. You still feel the shift when you walk barefoot on soil. You still sense something sacred in the hush between two thoughts. That is not modern intuition. That is ancestral memory alive inside you. In places like the Japanese archipelago, ancient Jomon people created pottery more elaborate than nearly anything found elsewhere in their time. Some pots were shaped with wild, twisting flames curling up their rims. They didn't need to be that beautiful, but they were, because the act of creation wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Even something as everyday as cooking became a kind of ceremony. The fire crackled, the pot steamed, and somewhere in that moment, beauty and survival met. That's something we've almost forgotten in the rush of modern life. That beauty isn't an extra, it's essential. It's how we remember that life matters. That time isn't just something to pass, but something to honor. That's why these ancient stories still comfort us, even when we don't fully understand them. because they remind us to slow down, to notice, to care. And across the Great Plains of North America, indigenous tribes followed ancient rhythms that stretched far beyond the arrival of metal or horse. They used every part of the animals they hunted. They sang to the land. They remembered their ancestors in ceremony, in drumbeat, in dance. Stone tools still found among the oldest sites are worn from use, not from violence, but from tending, skinning, scraping, shaping, preparing. It wasn't the weapon that defined the culture. It was the way it was used. And always, there was gratitude. That perhaps is the deepest thread of all gratitude. The Stone Age people, wherever they lived, didn't believe they deserved what the earth gave. They believed they were blessed by it. Each meal was a gift. Each safe night a mercy. Each child born a continuation of something sacred. And when someone died, they weren't discarded. They were returned. Buried with beads, pigments, sometimes even a favorite tool or a carved animal figure. Graves were not dark places, they were doorways. And those who passed through were not forgotten. They were spoken of, sung for, remembered in the stories told around the fire. Just like now, because you are remembering too. Even if you didn't live those lives, even if you can't name the people, the places, the tools, the remembering is happening. In your breath, in your calm. In the part of you that knows this story is not just about you, it includes you. You're not looking back from a distance. You are within the spiral, another handprint on the wall. So let that hand rest now. Let your thoughts fall away, like ash from a burned branch. There's nothing to do, nothing to solve. Just listen, just be. The fire is still burning. The story is still being told. This isn't about information anymore. It's about connection. And connection doesn't need to be loud to be strong. Sometimes it sounds like the breath of someone sleeping beside you, or the faint creak of a wooden floor in the middle of the night, or the wind passing through leaves older than cities. That's the sound of this story. It's not booming, it's present. You might be surprised to know how many pieces of the Stone Age still live in the architecture of our world, not as relics in museums, but as rhythms in our behavior. The layout of villages, the way we gather in circles, the way we decorate walls, wear jewelry, braid hair. These aren't modern inventions. They're echoes, repetitions, rituals carried forward across thousands of years. And it's not just in the objects, it's in the gestures. The way we kneel beside a loved one who's hurting, the way we instinctively hum when we're comforting someone, the way we sway slightly when we stand before something sacred. These are Stone Age movements, still flowing through your body. You don't need to be taught them. You were born knowing them. In southern Africa, the Sand people, sometimes called Bushmen, have traditions that stretch back tens of thousands of years. Their rock art tells stories of animals, of hunts, of dances that lasted through the night. Some dances weren't for celebration, they were for healing. Circles formed, songs rose, feet struck the earth in rhythm, and the energy built, not as performance, but as medicine. This was not symbolic, it was functional. They danced each other back to life. And in their cosmology, the world was not divided into human and animal, living and spirit. Everything was interwoven. The antelope could become a messenger. The trance state could open a door. Even a gust of wind could carry a warning. This wasn't a primitive belief system. It was a refined awareness of connection, the kind we've tried to rediscover through science, therapy, philosophy. They already had it. They lived it, and were beginning to remember. In South America, the oldest signs of human presence stretched deep into the rainforest, and even deeper into memory. Some sites suggest people were there far earlier than we used to think. Long before pyramids, long before empires, they moved through the jungle, not with machetes, but with knowledge. With listening, they left behind not vast cities, but altered ecosystems, soil rich from centuries of care, plants arranged in patterns, not by accident, but by design. The land itself became their legacy. What if we thought about legacy that way today? Not as a monument with your name on it, but as a place left better. A story told gently enough that it's remembered long after the voice falls quiet. That's what the Stone Age offers us. Not just a glimpse of the past, but a guide for the future. Not in the tools themselves, but in the way they were made. Slowly, with hands, with intention. Because everything was slower then. Not out of necessity, but out of wisdom. Food was gathered slowly. Homes were built slowly. Disputes were resolved slowly, over long walks or shared meals. The slowness wasn't inefficient. It was human. It allowed time for feeling, for healing, for change to happen without breaking everything apart. Even stories were slow. They weren't told all at once. They were shared over weeks, in pieces, each part shaped by the mood of the night, the age of the listener, the weight of the silence between words. That's the kind of story you're in now. One that trusts you to be patient. One that doesn't rush to the end, because it knows the journey is the meaning. And as your eyes grow heavier, as your body sinks deeper into rest, know this: you are not drifting away. You are sinking into something solid, something ancient. You are returning to the rhythm that has held humanity since the very beginning. Thank you for watching. Sleep well and come back for more history.